Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight we journey to the ancient capital of Kyoto, where lanterns shimmer softly against the cool night air. Imagine narrow pathways lined with wooden beams and paper screens. A gentle breeze stirring the warm glow of flickering flame. The city settles into quiet murmurs as footsteps echo on cobblestones, each lantern casting a pool of light that blends seamlessly with the mist. So, before the silence of night surrounds you, take a moment to like and subscribe. Just if this brought you peace of mind, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The ancient capital of Kyoto, with its elegant streets and winding pathways, has long been synonymous with beauty and tranquility. In the heart of this city, particularly in the Heian period 1794–1185, the nights were bathed in a soft, flickering glow. Lanterns, both large and small, were the beacons that guided people through the narrow, mist-laden streets. The delicate light they emitted was nothing like the harsh brightness of modern-day bulbs. It was a warm, amber hue, designed not to disturb the natural flow of the world, but to blend gently into the shadows. At night, the city came alive in a different way. The chatter of the marketplace, the hum of activity from the Imperial court, and the rhythmic steps of travelers slowly faded into the quiet murmur of the night. People, most of them wearing dark kimonos and sandals, would stroll along the paths illuminated by these lanterns, the atmosphere taking on a dreamlike quality. The lanterns themselves were often made of paper or thin, light wood, carefully crafted and painted with delicate patterns, sometimes depicting nature, other times featuring symbolic figures from the various folk legends that permeated the culture. The designs on the lanterns reflected the tastes of the aristocracy, those who inhabited the court and had the luxury of time to appreciate such things. For them, it wasn't just about light, it was about beauty, harmony, and the fleeting nature of life. In the Imperial city, lanterns were more than mere functional items. They were symbols. The gentle glow cast by these lanterns illuminated not only the streets but the souls of those who walked beneath them. They were an integral part of both the social and spiritual fabric of Kyoto. The lanterns marked the passage of time and the season. Special festivals were held, during which lanterns were displayed in a grand fashion, each one a piece of artistry in its own right. The most famous of these festivals was the Obon, a time when the dead were believed to return to the earth to visit their living relatives. During Obon, the lanterns were lit with particular reverence, their flickering flames symbolizing the spirits of the ancestors. It wasn't just about remembrance, it was about creating a spiritual connection, a moment in time when the living and the dead could momentarily coexist. As one walked through Kyoto at night, the lanterns provided a visual rhythm, a kind of slow-motion heartbeat of the city. Some lanterns hung low from wooden beams, casting faint shadows on the cobblestone streets. Others were carried by people, especially in the processions of the nobility, where their movements would ripple through the air like ghosts, tracing slow arcs of light. A soft wind would sometimes stir, making the paper lanterns sway gently, casting moving patterns on the ground. There was something almost meditative about it. The flicker of light, the soft breeze, and the quiet hum of the night combined to form an experience that could only be felt in that moment, in that place. Of course, not all lanterns were purely for the benefit of the people. The aristocratic families, especially those in the highest circles of the court, would sometimes place their lanterns in strategic positions to create a sense of power. A well-lit entrance to a family compound could suggest wealth, influence, and status. The very size and design of the lantern would indicate the family's importance, with some families employing lanterns that were more intricate and elegant than others. The wealthier the family, the grander the lantern. It was an art form, yes, but also a subtle signal to those who might pass by. But not everything in Kyoto at night was so serene. The lantern-lit streets could also be dangerous, especially if one was caught out in the darker corners of the city. Kyoto was a city of power, with its imperial palace at the heart, and its intrigues extended into the nighttime hours. There were whispers of secret meetings and clandestine exchanges happening under the cover of darkness, illuminated only by the weak light of lanterns. Assassins, courtiers plotting to unseat rivals, and the occasional rogue bandit all used the cover of night to their advantage. Lanterns, though they offered a soft glow, could cast deep shadows, and it was into these shadows that many of the city's secrets were kept. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Heian period was the way in which the aristocrats, particularly the court nobles, would use these lantern-lit walks as a way of connecting with their emotions. Court life was famously formal, with strict codes of conduct and ritual. But beneath the layers of protocol, there were often moments of personal vulnerability. The quiet, flickering light of the lanterns seemed to provide a space where emotions, long buried beneath layers of social expectations, could finally surface. The slow, meditative walk through the lantern-lit streets was often seen as a way to process one's feelings, whether joy, sorrow, or even longing. For the women of the court, these lantern-lit walks were often the moments when they could truly express their individuality. Though they were cloistered within the confines of the court, their walks beneath the lanterns provided a quiet rebellion against the rigid structures that governed their lives. In those moments, as their footsteps echoed softly along the stone paths, they were able to slip momentarily into something resembling freedom, surrounded by the warm, inviting glow of their lanterns. For some, the lanterns of Kyoto became a symbol of the fleeting beauty of life. It wasn't uncommon for people to remark upon the light of the lanterns in the same breath as the transience of the seasons. This connection to the natural world was ever present in the minds of the Heian aristocrats, who found deep meaning in the way nature seemed to mirror the human experience. The delicate balance of light and shadow, of fire and paper, seemed to reflect the very fragility of existence. In many ways, these lanterns were reminders that life, like the light they emitted, was impermanent. The flicker of a flame could be extinguished in a moment, and it was this transience that made the lanterns so poetic. And in that soft reminder, the court moved through its nightly routines, as if the glow itself were a kind of etiquette. In the grand compounds north of the city's central avenue, servants trimmed wicks and warmed inkstones while screens were adjusted to turn direct flame into a patient haze. The rooms were arranged to encourage drifting rather than striding. Long galleries, polished boards, and the sound of silk slipping by. Illumination was never excessive. It was deliberately incomplete. A corner left in shadow gave the face a kinder outline, and gave politics the same. If you wanted to tell a rival you were present but not aggressive, you stood where the light kissed your sleeve and spared your eyes. It was the capital's favorite compromise between visibility and deniability. Inside this hush, power looked like family. It was not a metaphor. The Heian elite arranged real marriages for abstract ends, and the Fujiwara clan perfected the art of turning sons-in-law into emperors and daughters into empresses. The method was simple in theory, exhausting in practice. A senior Fujiwara would serve as regent to a young sovereign. He would marry his daughter to that sovereign. He would then become grandfather to the next sovereign and remain indispensable. The cycle repeated until the genealogy is tangled into a careful knot. Under lantern glow, the knot seemed pretty. By daylight, it could pinch. During the reign of Emperor Ikijo, the knot tightened with operatic grace. He was intelligent, cautious, and very young at the beginning, which made him perfect for a city that preferred subtleties to grand gestures. The palace floated at night like a ship of wood and lacquer, and within it the women who defined the age kept long hours reading, writing, and trading polished remarks. 2 salons, 2 moods, 2 lanternscapes. On one side, Empress Teishi, called Sadako, in some records, gathered wits sharper than a winter breeze. On the other, Empress Shoshi, sometimes known as Akiko, cultivated a library of serenity backed by her father's immovable will. The flame was the same. The shadows behaved differently. Teichi's circle prized quickness. The light at her gatherings fell clean across paper, so characters would look crisp. Scrolls were unrolled with a little snap that said gently, "Do keep up." The favored companion here was Seishonagon, whose lists and observations captured the way a sleeve moved at dawn, or how a sudden shower could rearrange a mood. She noticed surfaces, but in Heian life, surfaces were content. The angle of a fan could qualify as evidence. The line of a roof under moonlight could make a point more eloquently than an argument. At Teishi's, visitors learned that brilliance could be worn casually, like perfume, and that the lamp's edge made flattery and mockery almost indistinguishable. Across the palace, Shoshi's salon preferred a slower burn. The lamps were often set behind screens, so the glow seeped rather than struck. The sound of pages turning carried farther than conversation. Here, Murasaki Shikibu wrote with the patience of a gardener, planting scenes that would bloom several chapters later. Her fictional prince grew up under the same dim gold that softened real faces in the corridors, and he moved through rooms that felt convincingly lit by the same wavering flame. The salon's tone was reflective, a little melancholy, like someone remembering a summer night while still living in it. Power came wrapped in calm. It still counted. Both empresses were young, both were clever, both were trapped, though the walls pretended to be made of poetry. The competition between their households is often described in courtly metaphors, as if the stakes were limited to who hosted the better plum viewing, or who layered the most tasteful robes. The stakes were stronger than that. Teishi's fortunes were bound to her brothers and uncles. When her father died, the delicate scaffolding under her position tilted. Meanwhile, Shoshi's father, Fujiwara no Michinaga, did not tilt. He mastered the game so completely that the board began to look like his furniture. Under the lanterns, the difference felt personal. One salon's light flickered when rumors moved. The other salon's light did not seem to notice the wind. At night, the court resorted itself into small clusters, each cluster like an island outlined by a square of glow. Musicians coaxed a koto's strings into long sighs, a room away. Perfume waited in warm cups. The scent competitions, famous and slightly absurd, were not really about scent. They were about memory and taste, both useful in politics. A lady used a blend associated with early autumn, and those who recognized it shared a signal. We read the same poems, we understand the same timing. Another chose a fragrance suggestive of mountain mist, and that was a quiet way of saying she preferred restraint to display. It was possible to vote without speaking. The lamp watched everything and had no opinion. The devotion to appearance could veer into the theatrical. Hair reached the floor, and then some. Sleeves behaved like scenery. A robe could weigh as much as a child, and the layered colors matched a season, a cloud type, a vague emotion. The point, as always, was controlled excess. A bad night meant a robe too bright under the lamp. A worse night meant a remark too clever across the lamp. The best night meant a poem slid between blinds, ink still damp, just long enough to be noticed, and just brief enough to be deniable. This was a world that ranked emotions by finish quality. Like lacquer, raw feeling was considered draft material. The lamp's gentle cone was a reminder: keep everything polished that lies within reach, and let everything else sink out of frame. If this sounds peaceful, it was, in the way a still pond is peaceful while something moves beneath. The clan marriages repeated across generations, and the spiral toward consanguinity was described in careful euphemisms. Cousin could mean a convenient degree of proximity. Aunts could mean opportunity disguised as tradition. Uncles arranged futures with the steady hands of men who believed that blood was an obedient tool. For a while it was. The short lives that followed say otherwise. Many women died young. Many infants did not live long enough to be named with ceremony. The records are tender and abrupt. A birth, a short celebration, a silence. The light could not be blamed. It simply showed what was happening, politely, and left everyone to draw conclusions at a whisper. Taishi's fate carries that hush. She dazzled, then diminished with alarming speed. She gave the court a prince, and for a delicate moment it seemed the balance might hold. Then illness, or complications, or simply the body's refusal to cooperate with history, erased the possibility. Chroniclers do not agree on every detail. What they do agree on is the date of her absence, and the way the tone of the palace changed after. Lanterns, unhelpful as ever, did not flicker in tribute. They simply continued to be lit at dusk and extinguished at dawn, while people recalculated their alignments. Her son would not become emperor. Her salon lost momentum. The room remembered her brightness. The city absorbed it like breath fades in cool air. Shoshi lived long enough to watch brightness harden into position. She became mother to 2 future emperors, and carried the correct titles at the correct times, a sequence only 1 or 2 families in any century can arrange without breaking. She endured the parody of security that comes from being central to a system you did not design. To call her powerful is both accurate and incomplete. A person can be central and still be contained. The evenings in her wing radiated a steadiness that read as victory. But victory in Heian terms often meant successfully managing regret. It meant carrying the lantern and never tripping, not even once in public. Meanwhile, Michinaga moved like a man who believed lighting was destiny. He understood entrances. He sent processions down the main thoroughfares at twilight, when the glow made ox-drawn carriages look like floating rooms. The wheels creaked, the cloaks shimmered, and the message reached even those who pretended not to watch. This is the family that decides which names endure. His diaries, plainly written, almost blunt compared to the court's usual shimmer, describe days of meetings and nights of satisfaction, which is a modest way of reporting victory after victory. He cultivated temples, placed kin in sacred posts, and folded religious prestige into household politics so neatly that the hem never showed. If lanterns ever felt used, they didn't say so. The palace architecture cooperated with the night. Courtyards accepted moonlight with good manners. Corridors staged silhouettes. Sliding screens created privacy that was more performance than fact, since the gaps at the edges were intentionally unthreatening. You could hear almost everything, you could see almost nothing. Those two facts formed the engine of gossip and the grammar of love affairs. Heian romances, both fictional and recorded, are essentially exercises in managing proximity. A glance through blinds, a poem tied to a spray of grass, a visit timed for mist. The lantern served as chaperone, and accomplice, too dim for scandal, bright enough for plausible innocence. Health, of course, was not a fan of dim spaces and heavy silk. The air inside could grow stale during long gatherings, and smoke from lamps argued quietly with lungs and eyes. People complained of headaches and fevers and vague exhaustion. The city treated those symptoms with rest and prayer, and occasional diets that sound gentle until you realize they were not chosen so much as obeyed. Pills and herbs and sutras made the rounds. The physicians of the day did what they could, which was non-trivial and not quite enough. The court's answer to frailty was, as ever, aesthetic. Walk slowly, speak softly, look composed. If a robe weighed too much for weak shoulders, that was not the robe's fault, and certainly not a reason to choose fewer layers. Outside the palace, temple compounds offered a more anchored glow. Their lamps were steadier, more concerned with continuity than charm. Monks copied sutras in that light, long past midnight, and the slow, wet brush on paper sounded like considered breathing. The city's elite visited, donated, and brought their anxieties along as if dropping them at the door might count as devotion. Sometimes it did. A vow to take orders later in life was a standard form of spiritual hedging. If fortune failed, there was always the refuge of a shaved head and simpler robes. If fortune held, the vow could be deferred indefinitely with gratitude. The lamp in the cloister did not care either way. It had one job and did it quietly. From a modern distance, the court can look like a long costume drama with excellent stationery. That is not entirely wrong and not entirely fair. The writing mattered because memory mattered, and memory mattered because power was transmitted through claims wrapped in poetry. A genealogy recorded with elegance worked like a key. A letter kept in careful hands became a witness. When Murasaki described a fictional court in detail, she was documenting a real preference, a world in which behavior is justified by beauty and error is corrected by style. She saw the strain involved in maintaining that equation and turned it into art, thin enough to slip under any door. Her pages are the city's best night walkers. They glow, but softly, in private rooms. Mothers negotiated an algebra of hope. The variables were small and ruthless. Which aunt was currently influential? Which festival had gone well? Which illness had passed without leaving a mark? Little boys learned to bow and memorize names. Little girls learned to carry themselves as if watched, which in the palace was a sensible assumption, masquerading as etiquette. Some of them became nuns. Some of them became empresses. Some of them became footnotes with beautiful handwriting. The lanterns treated these paths the way the river treated leaves. Equal attention, gentle indifference. There were inevitably moments when the surface cracked. Fires did occur. The city was wooden, and seasons made promises it sometimes could not keep. A stray spark, a strong wind, and a line of rooms became a memory in an hour. People saved what counted most, which was, depressingly often, the documents. Portable beauty outranked heavy comfort. A chest of poems could be carried. A life's worth of chairs could not. Afterwards, the courtyards looked larger. The replacement buildings smelled of fresh timber. The first night back, the lamp halos seemed raw and overly sincere. like new acquaintances trying too hard. A few weeks later, the glow returned to its preferred shyness, and the court resumed polishing its manners to a sound like distant rain. As the 11th century ripened, another adjustment arrived in the form of retired emperors who continued to influence the throne from monastic quarters. It was a clever shift, half political, half spiritual. Like many Heian innovations, a sovereign could abdicate, move behind temple walls, and keep a hand on the lever by means of counsel and kin. In theory, this threatened Fujiwara dominance. In practice, it required the same families to advise in the same rooms, at the same hours, with the same lamps. The city had invented a new shadow without changing the light source. Everyone pretended this was different. Everyone behaved exactly the same. The glow approved, or at least failed to object. Meanwhile, the common city slept and woke and slept again, largely untroubled by whose sleeve draped which veranda. Craftsmen shaped lacquer that traveled into palaces. Gardeners clipped pines into calm. Markets closed early by court standards because lamps were expensive and the moon did not take requests. There is comfort in imagining a boundary between high politics and ordinary life, but even at night the boundary was porous. A nurse in a narrow lane listened for the same temple bell that told a minister his hour had passed. A courier trotted through the same gate that framed an empress's procession at dusk. The light did not segregate, it simply rationed itself according to purse and purpose. In those rationed hours, letters traveled, couriers ran with wrapped packets held close to the chest, careful of dew and smoke. The most precious messages were small. A poem with 5 lines could shift a season's alliances. A fragment reporting a fever could cause a quiet panic. It is easy to laugh at a political structure held together by literature until you realize all structures are held together by something people agree to notice. The Heian choice was words, fabrics, and the choreography of nights. It worked until it didn't, which is the life cycle of every choice. The lanterns, for their part, never learned irony. They were earnest, consistent, and subject to breezes. They made beauty possible and secrecy manageable. They kept the city's ambition in a kind of velvet harness. When you imagine a court lady leaning near the flame to read a freshly arrived poem while her attendant watches for footsteps in the hall, you are seeing the system at its most honest. 2 people, a small light, a decision, the rest is paperwork and festivals. Some nights, even the powerful look tired. The makeup of composure is heavy, and so is the story a family tells itself about why it deserves to be central. You can practice it for years and still feel the strap at the end of the day. The rooms did not sympathize. They stayed elegant. The corridors stayed long. The lamps burned down. A servant pinched the wick, and the last glow held briefly before it let go. Most decisions could wait until morning. The city preferred it that way. Sleep was the one ritual that refused an audience, and as the palace settled, the sky over the capital did what skies do. It ignored schedules and chose its own palette. On fortunate nights, a pale wash of stars showed through the haze. On ordinary nights, the air was a solid dark, and the lamps below did all the work. This was fine. The people of Heian had no trouble making their own constellations out of courtyard lights and reflected gold. They charted careers by those artificial stars, navigated marriages by them, and recorded their histories by their careful rise and dimming. The heavens remained unconsulted. The city preferred its own ceiling. In the colder months, the rhythm of the lanterns changed. Winter was not kind to paper, nor to those who relied on soft fire for warmth. Snow, when it came, softened the edges of everything, and the faint orange light against the white produced a kind of accidental elegance that painters later adored. Lanterns stood out like gentle punctuation marks, the glow holding its ground against the silent, heavy air. Courtyards became quiet stages for people, wrapped in layered robes, their breath forming tiny clouds that drifted toward the eaves. The palace didn't sleep more in winter, it simply spoke more softly. The Heian court's fascination with impermanence reached its peak in these cold nights. Poems written during this time often mention frost on bridges and lantern flames bowing in the wind. It was a season that invited reflection, and the aristocracy, who were constitutionally incapable of ignoring a good metaphor, treated every frozen garden as a lesson in mortality. A wilted chrysanthemum, a cracked paper screen, or a lamp that failed to light on the first try, all were opportunities to sigh meaningfully. It wasn't performative sorrow, exactly. It was more like a cultural reflex. When the world presented a fleeting image, they responded with ink and melancholy. The Imperial Palace itself, Heiankyo's nerve center, adapted its lighting practices to these moods. Lanterns were placed closer together in the galleries, creating long corridors of warm light that looked almost liquid against the night air. Servants carried portable lamps through the halls, their silhouettes bobbing like slow-moving stars. One could follow a noble woman's walk, purely by the progression of lantern glow along the veranda, a quiet choreography dictated by light and breath. When guests arrived for poetry contests or musical evenings, they passed through several layers of this illumination, each threshold softening their entrance until finally they appeared in the central room as if they had been conjured by the building itself. The obsession with subtlety extended to timing. Lanterns were often lit, not at sunset, but a little after, allowing the first moments of darkness to settle before introducing light. This created a more dramatic effect, though they would never use that word. A nobleman strolling through the city would emerge from a nearly dark street into a lantern-lit gate, and the transition would feel intentional, like stepping through a veil. It wasn't simply practical lighting, it was staged. The court was always staging something: meetings, marriages, rivalries, reconciliations. Even darkness had its cues. In religious contexts, the lantern's role deepened. Kyoto's temples, some perched just outside the main grid of the city, maintained a steadier relationship with light. Temple lamps were sturdier, often made of bronze or stone, and less concerned with artistic delicacy. They were symbols of continuity rather than aesthetic gestures. Pilgrims walked up icy steps at night to place small offerings, lighting votive candles in niches where monks had already begun their chants. The sound of sutras mixed with the crackle of lantern flames, forming a rhythm that could carry a listener into a trance if they stood long enough. Some courtiers visited these temples under cover of night, not for dramatic conversions, but for the kind of quiet spiritual maintenance that aristocrats practiced when they felt fate breathing too close. Lantern walks were not limited to the elite. Commoners, though their lamps were smaller and plainer, participated in their own nighttime rituals. Shopkeepers hung simple paper lanterns with brush-painted family crests outside their doors, signaling both presence and identity. Travelers arriving at night looked for these marks as signs of safety. Street vendors carried lanterns on poles, the bobbing lights announcing roasted chestnuts or dumplings. Long before voices reached the street, children followed these moving constellations with wide eyes, their own homes lit by smaller flames tucked safely away from drafts. Kyoto's nights were communal in a way that modern cities rarely manage. a shared fabric of faint light, drifting conversations, and seasonal scent. That said, nighttime travel carried its share of risks. Lanterns could illuminate, but they could not defend. Banditry was a quiet problem on the outskirts, and sometimes within the city itself. Narrow lanes between compounds could harbor figures who knew how to step just beyond the circle of light. The city guard patrolled, but their reach was limited, and their lanterns often arrived after events had resolved themselves in favor of the quick-footed. The aristocracy dealt with this mostly by timing their movements. Traveling in groups, sending servants ahead with lamps to clear the way, or simply not venturing out unnecessarily. For the lower classes, caution was a nightly companion. A single lantern could both reassure and betray you, casting a beacon for friendly eyes and unfriendly ones alike. Inside the noble residences, winter evenings were an exercise in controlled stillness. Rooms were rearranged to trap warmth, screens adjusted to minimize drafts, and lanterns clustered in ways that would horrify a modern fire marshal. Courtiers huddled in layered robes, sipping warm sake and exchanging poems about the cold, the wind, and the brevity of existence. It was not exactly cheerful, but neither was it bleak. Melancholy, to the Heian mind, was not a flaw to be fixed. It was a flavor to be savored. Lanterns were the garnish, just enough light to let the sadness shimmer. Meanwhile, the political structure continued its quiet evolutions. Retired emperors had begun to assert more influence, operating from temple complexes, but still very much part of the capital's power network. This created a situation where the city effectively had multiple centers of authority, each glowing faintly in its own orbit. Lantern-lit processions from these retired imperial courts were carefully choreographed to signal respect without surrender, autonomy without rebellion. Watching such a procession wind through the streets was like watching a diplomatic poem unfold in real time, line by glowing line. One particularly evocative image from the chronicles describes a procession to the temple of Hojoj. On a snowy night, courtiers carried long-handled lanterns wrapped in thin silk to protect the flames from wind. The light diffused through the fabric, creating soft halos that reflected off the snow. The procession moved slowly, partly for ceremony, partly to keep the flames alive. From a distance, it must have looked like a moving constellation gliding through a silent field. People emerged from their homes just to watch, not speaking, simply standing in the snow as the soft glow passed by. For a few moments, hierarchy flattened into shared wonder. Inside the palace, literary pursuits didn't stop for the season. If anything, they intensified. Winter nights were long, and lanterns gave poets a way to stretch time. Groups gathered to compose linked verse, each person contributing a line that responded to the previous one. The lantern light created an intimacy that daylight could not match. Faces were half in shadow, gestures were slowed by the layers of clothing, and words floated through the air like the smoke from the lamps themselves. Some of these poems survive, tucked into collections that reveal the mixture of humor, sadness, and sly political commentary that defined Heian court life. The jokes were often layered like robes, meant to be appreciated by those who understood the fabric. For women of the court, winter nights offered both opportunity and danger. The relative quiet made it easier to send secret messages, poems, or tokens through intermediaries. A single lantern burning late in a particular wing could mean someone was waiting. A lantern extinguished early could signal disinterest or precaution. These cues were subtle, but well understood by those who lived in this world. Romance, as practiced in Heian Kyoto, was a careful game played in the spaces between lanterns and blinds. carried on in whispers, ink, and calculated absence. It was rarely about passion in the modern sense. It was about positioning, emotional, social, and sometimes literal. Health concerns lingered in the background like uninvited guests. Smoke from oil lamps, irritated lungs, tightly closed rooms bred illnesses that spread easily in winter. The court's medical practitioners advised ventilation and cleanliness, which were excellent ideas that collided awkwardly with reality. People cracked open screens to let in air, then complained about drafts. They experimented with different oils for lamps, searching for cleaner burns. Whale oil, sesame oil, and sometimes wax were used, each with its own smell and price point. Wealthier households preferred oils that burned with less smoke, partly for health, partly for aesthetics. Nobody wanted a room full of literary geniuses coughing their way through a poetry contest. As the season deepened, the city's nights took on a rhythm of anticipation. Lanterns became markers not only of space, but of time, signals that the year was winding toward its ritual turn. New Year's celebrations, though quieter than their modern equivalents, were deeply symbolic. Lanterns were cleaned, repaired, or replaced. Temples hung new lamps, their surfaces polished, until they caught the faintest light. In noble households, servants carefully prepared the decorative lanterns used for special occasions, their frames reinforced, their paper replaced with fresh, crisp sheets. Lighting these on the first night of the new year was both practical and ceremonial, a way of inviting good fortune to see clearly where it was going. And for a moment, the city seemed united under this shared ritual. From the highest palace halls to the humblest merchant store, lamps were lit, casting overlapping circles of warmth across Kyoto's grid. Families stood together to watch the flames catch. Children held their breath, hoping their lantern would light on the first try. Adults whispered prayers, some loud, some internal. The night air filled with the mingled scents of oil, incense, and cold earth. Above it all, the sky remained indifferent, but the city did not care. It had its own constellation, carefully maintained, renewed year after year. And in the stillness that followed the celebrations, one could walk the streets of Heian and feel suspended between eras. The footsteps on the frosted paths sounded timeless. The glow of the lanterns softened everything into a shared texture. Politics, poetry, ambition, love, all seemed to fold into that same amber light, flickering steadily against the winter dark. Spring arrived like a deliberate exhale, and the lanterns adjusted accordingly. Where winter nights were about containment and introspection, spring was about soft unveiling. The air grew gentler, carrying the scent of plum blossoms into courtyards that had spent months listening only to wind and distant bells. Lanterns, freshly repaired after their seasonal wear, were hung in more open patterns. The point was no longer to keep the world out, but to gently invite it in. Courtyards glowed like ink paintings brought to life, each tree and veranda edge carefully framed by amber halos. The Heian aristocracy, unsurprisingly, saw this as an opportunity for events. Seasonal viewing parties were essential exercises in taste, and spring nights were their favored stage. Plum blossoms came first, then cherry, then wisteria, each with its own etiquette and poetic vocabulary. Lanterns were arranged so their light would fall on the blossoms at just the right angle, emphasizing their brief perfection. Guests strolled slowly, pausing to compose or recite poems about the scene. A poorly timed lantern placement could ruin the entire aesthetic, so attendants adjusted positions with the seriousness of priests preparing an altar. The result was theatrical, but the mood was subdued. It was as if the city itself were whispering, "Pay attention, this won't last." The Imperial Palace hosted some of the grandest blossom viewing evenings. Emperors, empresses, and courtiers gathered in gardens designed for maximum poetic resonance. Lanterns lined the paths in careful intervals, their light catching the petals as they drifted down like faint snow. Poets compared falling petals to fleeting love, to fading glory, to promises made under changing skies. Everyone agreed these comparisons were obvious, but that was part of the charm. Heian culture thrived on repetition made beautiful, like lanterns themselves, relit each evening without apology for sameness. At the same time, spring was a season of movement. Pilgrimages to temples and shrines increased, with nobles traveling outside the city in slow-moving processions that blurred the line between devotion and display. Lanterns on long poles led these processions through forest paths, their light kite glimpses of deer, mossy stones, and rushing streams. The air carried hints of incense, smoke, and wet earth. Monks at remote temples prepared for these visits with meticulous care, lighting rows of stone lanterns that traced the path up to the main halls. At night, the approach to a temple looked less like a road and more like a quiet constellation dropped onto the ground. These pilgrimages often served multiple purposes. Spiritual renewal was one, of course, but so was political signaling. A well-timed visit to a prestigious temple could demonstrate piety, influence, or simple presence at the right moment. Courtiers measured each other's movements with the same subtlety they applied to poetry. Lanterns helped orchestrate these interactions, marking who arrived when and where, how many lamps burned in their entourage, and what sort of light they preferred, bright, modest, or softly veiled. It was entirely possible to insult someone using only the size and timing of your lantern display. Kyoto was that kind of city. In the residential quarters, households marked the season by changing the designs on their paper lanterns. Plum blossoms gave way to cherry motifs, then to flowing water patterns as the weather warmed. Some families commissioned new paintings from skilled artisans, ensuring that their lanterns announced both seasonal awareness and refined taste. Children were sometimes allowed to help paint the simpler designs, their small brushstrokes immortalized for a season before being replaced the next year. It was a fleeting contribution, but it fit neatly into the Heian way of viewing the world, where impermanence was not just accepted, but cultivated like a garden. Evenings grew longer. The soft breeze of spring made it pleasant to linger outside, and noble families began to hold poetry contests in their gardens rather than indoors. Lanterns hung from eaves, trees, and temporary stands, transforming gardens into softly glowing theaters. Competitors sat beneath the blossoms, listening to nightingales while composing lines meant to capture the ineffable. Judges, usually high-ranking courtiers with reputations for discernment, listened with faces arranged in careful neutrality. A misplaced metaphor could sink a career. A perfectly timed phrase could open doors that years of flattery could not. It was a delicate game, played under the watch of lanterns that illuminated brilliance and blunders alike. For the common people, spring brought festivals to the streets. Markets stayed open later, lanterns strung above stalls selling fresh herbs, sweets, and small charms. Musicians performed on street corners, their melodies mingling with the chatter of shoppers and the laughter of children chasing each other through pools of light. Craftsmen displayed lanterns for sale, ranging from plain functional models to elaborate painted pieces meant for wealthier buyers. The smell of grilled food, incense, and damp wood filled the air. Unlike the aristocratic events, these street festivals were boisterous in their own way. But even here, the lanterns kept the chaos gently tethered, their glow creating boundaries between noise and night. One of the more striking customs during spring festivals was the floating of lanterns on water. People would gather near the Kamo River at dusk, lighting small lanterns and setting them adrift. The river carried them downstream in clusters, their reflections trembling on the surface. It was part offering, part spectacle, part wish-making. Some attached slips of paper with poems or prayers. Others simply watched in silence as their lantern drifted away. The sight of hundreds of tiny lights bobbing along the current was said to resemble a starry sky turned upside down. For a city so enamored with layered meanings, this was practically irresistible. Temples participated in this ritual too, releasing lanterns as symbolic offerings to ancestors and deities. Monks chanted as the lanterns floated away, their voices echoing against the water. People believed these lanterns carried their thoughts and hopes downstream, joining the flow that eventually disappeared into darkness. It was less about expecting a tangible response, and more about acknowledging that some things must simply be released. The lanterns did not promise answers, they promised a graceful letting go. Meanwhile, court life continued its intricate maneuvers. Political factions waxed and waned like the moon, and lantern-lit evening gatherings often served as informal strategy sessions. A visiting courtier might drop a seemingly casual remark under the warm glow of a veranda lamp, and that remark could ripple through the palace by morning. Every shadow held a listener. Every lantern illuminated someone else's calculation. The Fujiwara clan still dominated the landscape, their influence threaded through marriage alliances, regencies, and temple patronage. But subtle shifts were happening. As retired emperors tested their growing power, and lesser aristocratic families sought to carve niches in the spaces the Fujiwara left unguarded, women of the court continued to write, observe, and influence in ways that were both overt and hidden. Diaries like those of Murasaki Shikibu and Sei Shonagon record these seasonal transitions with exquisite precision. Their words capture not just the events, but the textures, the way lantern light fell across a veranda, the sound of night insects rising with the warmth, the contrast between the stillness of the gardens and the buzzing currents of court intrigue. These writings, preserved centuries later, allow modern readers to walk through Heian nights without leaving their chairs. The lanterns flicker across the pages, just as they once flickered across gravel paths. As spring ripened towards summer, the lanterns grew both more necessary and more precarious. Warm nights meant longer gatherings outdoors, but they also meant insects swarming toward the light, and paper lanterns were easy prey. Servants swatted at moths with quiet resignation. Courtiers fanned themselves with elaborate fans, while pretending not to notice the occasional winged intruder landing in their sake cups. The heat also made the oils burn faster, so lanterns required more frequent tending. Servants moved like shadows between gatherings, trimming wicks, refilling reservoirs, adjusting positions to keep the illusion seamless. The light appeared effortless, because someone else was sweating to make it so. Through all of this, Kyoto remained balanced on the delicate edge between performance and sincerity. Lanterns were symbols, tools, decorations, and witnesses. They illuminated poetry contests and political conspiracies, family rituals and street festivals, temple pilgrimages and private romances. They revealed and concealed with equal grace. As spring gave way to the heavier air of early summer, their steady glow became both a comfort and a reminder that nothing, not even light, stays the same for long. Summer nights in Kyoto had their own temperament, where spring evenings were cool and softly perfumed. Summer brought warmth that clung to skin and made the air feel heavy. The lanterns adjusted, though they did not complain. Their flames seemed to breathe slower, as if pacing themselves through the humid nights. The paper shades sometimes wilted slightly under the moisture, their patterns blurring just enough to seem intentional. The city stayed awake longer, not because anyone particularly wanted to, but because the heat encouraged lingering in breezy corridors rather than retreating into rooms that held warmth like clay jars. The aristocracy continued their nocturnal routines, but summer changed the tone. Gardens became stages for evening cool-downs, with lanterns hung high in trees to catch whatever breeze the night was willing to offer. Courtiers reclined on polished verandas, fanning themselves with elegant nonchalance, while servants moved silently with trays of chilled sake. Fireflies appeared in the gardens, their faint lights dancing against the steady lantern glow. Poets predictably found metaphors in this contrast. Natural light that flickered unpredictably against human light that was disciplined and contained. Some saw this as a reminder of the balance between chaos and order. Others simply enjoyed watching insects do their thing while sipping drinks. Temples also adapted their lighting in summer. Larger bronze lanterns were sometimes left unlit until later in the evening to keep the compounds cooler. Chanting began later, after the day's heat had faded enough for monks to gather without feeling like they were cooking themselves in their robes. Visitors arrived in slower trickles, often bringing offerings that included incense meant to mask the inevitable summer smells of crowded spaces. In some temple precincts, special summer rituals involved hanging long strips of paper with prayers or poems, the lantern light illuminating the fluttering lines like a gallery of fragile hopes swaying in warm air. Among the commoners, summer nights were lively. Markets extended their hours, with lanterns strung close together overhead to keep away insects, and to a lesser extent, thieves. Vendors sold chilled treats, fans, lightweight fabrics, and herbal remedies for heat-induced lethargy. Musicians played louder to compete with the night chorus of cicadas. Children ran barefoot through the lantern-lit streets, chasing each other with the kind of wild energy only tolerated when the adults were too tired to intervene. The glow of hundreds of small lights gave the streets a festive look, even on ordinary evenings, as if the city itself were refusing to sleep. The court, however, did not entirely escape the effects of the heat. Night gatherings became more languid. Poetry contests slowed, not because the participants were any less clever, but because ink dried sluggishly and sleeves stuck to forearm. Fans became extensions of hands, flicking rhythmically in between lines of verse. Lanterns burned through oil at an alarming rate, partly because of the longer nights and partly because of insects drawn to the light like critics to a debut poem. Servants spent hours tending to lamps, refilling reservoirs, and replacing damaged paper. If winter evenings had the quiet precision of calligraphy, summer nights had the weary persistence of a scribe working past midnight. Despite the seasonal fatigue, summer offered moments of astonishing beauty. One such moment occurred during the Heian festival, which had already begun to take shape by the late Heian period. Although the festival evolved significantly in later centuries, its early versions featured processions of decorated floats and lanterns, winding through the city to appease restless spirits and encourage good health during the hot months. Families hung decorative lanterns outside their homes, sometimes with prayers written directly onto the paper. At night, the city glowed more brightly than usual, the festival turning streets into slow-moving rivers of light. The combination of warm air, chanting, music, and flickering flames created a sense of collective exhale, as if everyone were momentarily aligned under the same swaying lanterns. Court nobles participated in these festivals from a polite distance. They sponsored events, sent emissaries, and occasionally appeared in person, veiled behind blinds in their carriages. Lantern processions offered them both spectacle and political stage. A well-placed float, a particularly fine set of lanterns, or a generous donation could signal influence without a single public speech. The people understood these signals, even if they pretended to ignore them while enjoying the festivities. Politics, like light, seeped into everything. Inside palace walls, the summer brought subtle shifts in hierarchy. Illnesses, often seasonal, affected which courtiers were present at crucial moments. A sudden fever could remove someone from the game for weeks. Lantern-lit evening meetings sometimes included noticeably empty spaces where a powerful figure should have been sitting. These absences were noted, whispered about, and folded into calculations. The soft glow of the lanterns, impartial as ever, simply highlighted the gaps where influence once sat. Women of the court continued their quiet influence during these warm months. Diaries from this era describe summer nights filled with both languor and intrigue. Murasaki Shikibu, in particular, observed the way heat made people slightly less guarded. Under the lantern light, conversations drifted toward personal confessions, rivalries softened into complaints, and ambitions were cloaked in drowsy politeness. The glow didn't change, the people did. Even the most carefully composed personas loosened when faced with weeks of relentless warmth. The gardens around noble residences became stages for these changes. Lanterns hung among the trees illuminated nocturnal flowers, their petals opening under warm air. Courtiers sat quietly, letting the night do the talking. It was in these slow, humid evenings that small alliances were formed, not through grand gestures, but through shared silence. The passing of a fan or a comment delivered just softly enough to be plausible as idle observation. The lanterns made these moments possible by carving out small glowing spaces in which intentions could unfold at a human pace. Toward the end of summer, thunderstorms swept through Kyoto with dramatic timing. Lanterns were quickly brought indoors or extinguished to prevent fires. When the storms passed, the city felt freshly scrubbed, the air briefly lighter, and the lanterns returned to their posts with renewed purpose. People walked out after the rain to see reflections in the puddles. The light doubled, and trembling, children floated tiny lanterns in the streams formed along the streets, sending miniature fleets down toward the Kamo River. Adults pretended not to watch, but did anyway. As the days began to shorten again, the lanterns reclaimed their quiet dominance. The oppressive heat eased into the gentler warmth of early autumn, and the city seemed to exhale once more. Lantern designs shifted to autumn motifs, maple leaves, flowing water, and harvest patterns. Poets began composing verses about returning winds, about the sound of insects fading, about the way light itself seemed to grow more thoughtful as the season turned. The cycle prepared to repeat. Through every season, the lanterns of Kyoto marked time in their own language. They were there for grand political schemes and for the smallest family rituals. They lit the faces of emperors and street vendors with the same steady glow. They accompanied blossom viewing parties, temple pilgrimages, summer festivals, poetry contests, and solitary night walks. They witnessed ambition, melancholy, romance, and resignation without taking sides. Their paper walls absorbed smoke and poems alike, their flames rising and sinking with the same calm rhythm. By the close of the Heian period, Kyoto's lantern-lit nights had become a kind of shared memory, a texture that belonged to everyone who had ever walked those streets after dark. Centuries later, the city would change. Dynasties would fall, and technologies would evolve. but the idea of light drifting through night air, soft and deliberate, would remain. The lanterns outlasted the intrigues they once illuminated, leaving behind not records but impressions, as if the entire capital had been written in light. And if you were to walk through those streets on a summer night, long ago, with sandals tapping softly on stone and the air thick around you, you would have seen it too. The flicker, the hush, the steady breath of a city speaking in lanterns. One tale may end, but history never leaves us empty-handed. The moment one door shuts, another creaks open, spilling out a stranger secret, a darker echo, and a path we can't resist following. This is the bells of Byzantium, sounds of an ancient city. Imagine standing on a hill overlooking Constantinople in the late afternoon, somewhere between the scent of sea air and roasting bread. The sun leans toward the western horizon, casting long stripes of gold over tiled roofs, domes and narrow streets that run like veins through the city. A breeze drifts in from the Bosporus, carrying with it the mingled hum of markets, the cries of hawkers, the distant rhythm of oars on water, and then, as if summoned by invisible hands, the bells begin. Byzantine bells were not background noise. They were punctuation. They marked time, warned of danger, signaled ceremony, and wrapped the city in a shared auditory fabric. Unlike the mechanical clock towers of later centuries, these bells relied on human rhythm and community memory. Their sounds were woven into the routines of emperors, monks, merchants, and children alike, shaping the tempo of urban life long before printed timetables or public announcements existed. Constantinople was a city built for spectacle, and sound was part of its architecture. The capital of the Eastern Roman Empire was designed to impress, its massive walls wrapped around a teeming urban core, protecting palaces, forums, churches, markets, and ports. The Hagia Sophia dominated the skyline, a vast dome that seemed to hover in defiance of gravity. But equally important were the layers of sound that filled its interior and spilled into the streets. Bells, gongs, and handheld clappers were central to this auditory landscape. When they rang, the city listened. In the earliest centuries of Byzantine history, bells were modest instruments. They were small, handheld, often imported from the Latin West or the Near East, used in monasteries to mark hours of prayer or call wandering workers back to communal life. Over time, their presence expanded. By the 6th century, during the reign of Justinian, bells began appearing in larger and more public settings. Some were suspended in church courtyards or attached to simple wooden frames near entrances, where a pull on a rope could send sound rolling through a neighborhood. Constantinople's geography amplified these sounds in unusual ways. The city sat on a series of hills overlooking the waters of the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara. Sound traveled well over these natural amphitheaters. A bell struck in the courtyard of a monastery on one hill could be heard by fishermen mending their nets at the harbor below, or by vendors closing up their stalls before evening. The daily cadence of life became synchronized not by personal clocks, but by shared ears. If you didn't hear a bell, someone nearby would, and the knowledge would pass like a ripple. The bells of Hagia Sophia occupied a special place in this soundscape, though the great cathedral is most famous for its dome and mosaics. It also housed one of the most elaborate systems of bell signaling in the medieval world. Sources describe bronze bells of various sizes, tuned to different tones, suspended from wooden beams near the atrium. These bells were rung for liturgical purposes, announcing the beginning of services, calling clergy to prayer, marking processions, but they also had civic roles. During imperial ceremonies, they accompanied the arrival of dignitaries or the emperor himself, their tones resonating against marble and echoing down colonnaded streets. Monasteries added their own contributions, scattered throughout the city and its outskirts. Monastic communities developed intricate methods of marking the hours. Bells were rung at set times for the canonical hours: matins before dawn, prime at sunrise, terce mid-morning, sext at noon, none in the afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before sleep. Each community had slight variations, but the rhythm was broadly shared. A traveler walking through the city could tell roughly what time it was by the sequence of bells rising and fading as they moved between districts. Timekeeping was collective, not individual, but bells were not the only instruments. Wooden cementra planks struck with mallets were a uniquely Byzantine sound, especially in monastic settings where bells were sometimes restricted by tradition or circumstance. The cementron produced a resonant, percussive tone that could carry astonishing distances. It was said that monks in remote monasteries could be called to prayer with a single rhythmic pattern on a plank. In the city, the sound of a cementron might mingle with bells, creating a layered, almost musical texture that modern urban dwellers might find startlingly complex. Imperial ceremonies made full use of this sonic environment. When the emperor appeared in public, bells were not just rung, they were orchestrated. Trumpets, cementra, and bells combined in carefully timed patterns to announce his approach. The sound preceded him like a tide. Crowds gathered, banners were unfurled, and the city itself seemed to vibrate with expectation. The bells did not simply accompany power, they were part of its performance. Their tones reminded everyone, from palace officials to barefoot laborers, that imperial authority was not just seen, but heard. There were darker moments too. Bells served as alarm systems when fires broke out, which happened frequently in the densely built city. Watchmen stationed on high points would ring bells to alert neighborhoods, and the sound would cascade from one district to another like falling dominoes. During military threats, Persian sieges, Arab raids, or later Crusader fleets, the bells took on a sharper tone. Panic had its own soundtrack. Chronicles describe nights when the city walls echoed with the relentless clang of warning bells, mingling with the cries of soldiers and the shouts of citizens rushing to defend the gates. Religious feasts transformed the city into an ocean of sound. Easter, in particular, was marked by an explosion of bells at midnight. As the liturgy declared the resurrection, bells across the city rang simultaneously, their combined tones rising into the night sky like a bronze chorus. Fishermen on distant waters reported hearing the city sing. The sound was both overwhelming and reassuring, proof that the empire's heart was still beating, that the city stood, that the faith endured. For those living within the walls, these moments created memories that lasted lifetime. A child who heard the Easter bells from a crowded courtyard would carry that sound into adulthood, associating it with both the sacred and the communal. Travelers and envoys often commented on Constantinople's soundscape. Latin visitors, unused to the percussive cementra, described the city's mornings as struck into being. Arab writers marveled at the way bells announced not only religious services, but also civic events, blending church and state in a way unfamiliar to Islamic cities, where the human voice through the call to prayer dominated. The city's auditory identity was distinctive, as recognizable as its skyline. You could close your eyes at the harbor, listen for a few moments, and know exactly where you were. Life within homes also followed these cues. Households did not own personal bells. They didn't need to. Servants and family members went about their tasks according to the public signals. Bakers began their work before dawn, timing their kneading to the early samantra of nearby monasteries. Shopkeepers opened their shutters when the mid-morning bells sounded. Children were called in at sunset, often reluctantly when the vespers echoed through their neighborhoods. Even without watches, the city was remarkably synchronized, like a living clock powered by air and bronze. For the poor, bells were often both comfort and command. They could not control when bells rang, but they relied on them to structure their days. Bells signaled opportunities for alms at religious festivals, reminded them of curfews during troubled times, and warned them when fires or riots threatened their districts. The bells were impartial. They spoke to everyone at once, but the way their messages were received depended on one's place in society. To the emperor, a bell might mean the start of a procession. To a dock worker, it meant time to haul nets before dawn. There were also rules about bells. Not every church could install them at will. Permissions were sometimes required, particularly during periods when the imperial government sought to control public expressions of power. Bells were symbols as much as tools. A large, well-made bronze bell was expensive, requiring skilled artisans and significant resources. To display one was to declare a certain status. Monasteries competed, subtly, through the size and clarity of their bells, much as later cities would compete through their clock towers. Bronze was the preferred material for large bells, and Constantinople had skilled foundries capable of producing remarkable work. Some bells were cast using techniques derived from both Roman and Near Eastern traditions, producing rich, layered tones. There were even accounts of bells decorated with inscriptions, biblical verses, dedications to saints, or imperial names, so that their sound carried not just acoustics, but symbolic authority. When one of these bells rang, it wasn't just announcing an event, it was proclaiming the identity of the institution behind it. As evening descended over the city, the bells changed character. The sunset bells were softer, often rung by smaller handheld instruments, or gently struck some mantra. They marked the transition from commerce to contemplation, from public to private life. The markets quieted, the streets dimmed, and the sound of bells mingled with the rustle of wind through narrow alleys. Lanterns flickered into life, boats eased toward the docks, and families gathered in courtyards. The city, for all its grandeur, was still a collection of human lives stitched together by routine. Bells were the thread, and in that fading light, with the Bosporus shimmering below, and the dome of Hagia Sophia darkening against the sky, one could feel the city breathe in rhythm with its bells. It was not just a sound, it was a heartbeat cast in bronze. As night thickened over Constantinople, the soundscape did not fall silent. It simply changed key. The great bells that had thundered across hills in the daytime gave way to smaller tones. Monasteries maintained their vigil through the dark hours, and their bells marked the monastic hours, like quiet threads woven through the sleeping city. The samantra, struck with wooden mallets, carried their hollow knocks over the rooftops in deliberate, almost meditative rhythms. If the day belonged to public proclamations, the night belonged to steady reminders, prayers, discipline, continuity. From the harbor districts, the sounds were different again. Ship bells and clappers announced the return of late vessels. Fishermen navigated into port, guided partly by lantern light and partly by the faint echoes of bells from shore. Constantinople's geography, a city nestled between waters, meant sound traveled across the Bosporus, and the golden horn like messages whispered between sleeping giants. Even at midnight, someone standing on the sea walls might hear a solitary bell ringing from a distant monastery, the sound carrying across calm water like a ghost refusing to rest. This nocturnal soundscape reflected the dual nature of Byzantine urban life, profoundly spiritual and relentlessly practical. The bells calling monks to midnight prayers were the same bells that, a few hours later, would wake bakers and dock workers. The city's rhythms overlapped like voices in a choir, each distinct but part of a larger harmony. People learned to tell these tones apart, instinctively. A short, urgent peal meant something very different from the long, solemn toll of a monastic vigil. Bells were also storytellers of crisis. Constantinople endured its share of fires, earthquakes, and uprisings, and in those moments bells became urgent messengers. Fire was a constant threat in a city where wooden houses pressed close together. Watchmen stationed in towers and along the Theodosian walls kept bells ready for emergency alarms. When smoke curled into the night sky, the first bell would ring, and then others would answer in quick succession. It was less a single sound than a wave rolling through neighborhoods. People woke, grabbed buckets, and ran toward the clangor like iron filings to a magnet. There was no fire department, as we know it, only the shared knowledge that when bells screamed in the night, everyone had work to do. Sieges gave these bells their most dramatic roles. The city had endured major threats since its earliest days, but during the Arab sieges of the 7th and 8th centuries, the bells became an integral part of defense. Watchtowers struck bells to signal troop movements, breaches, or suspicious activity along the sea walls. In some chronicles, the bells are described as ringing so continuously during siege nights that people stopped sleeping altogether. The metallic chorus mixed with the sound of engines on the walls, soldiers shouting, and the steady lap of water against the city's foundations. For residents, those bells were both reassurance, proof that the defenses were active, and a relentless reminder that the enemy stood just beyond the torches. During the infamous Nika riots of 532, when the city nearly tore itself apart under Justinian's early reign, bells were sounded to summon soldiers and warn citizens to stay inside. Their tones were different from those used in liturgy or festivals. Fast, overlapping, and deliberately unsettling, bells became the city's loudest political commentators, clanging their alarm while factions brawled in the hippodrome. For days, Constantinople was filled with this confused chorus: bells, fires, chants, screams, until Imperial troops crushed the revolt. In the aftermath, the bells returned to their usual rhythms, almost as if sighing in relief. There was a curious relationship between bells and imperial authority. The emperor could order bells to be rung or silenced, and such commands carried weight. During periods of mourning, for example, bells were muffled or ceased entirely, casting the city into a kind of deliberate sonic vacuum. The absence of sound was as powerful as its presence. When an emperor died, the great bells of Hagia Sophia were struck slowly, their tones stretching into the air like long shadows. Markets closed, crowds gathered. The city knew before official proclamations reached every district. In this sense, bells were a form of mass communication centuries before printing presses or radios. Conversely, during coronations, the bells roared. The moment a new emperor was crowned inside Hagia Sophia, bells rang from multiple churches and monasteries in a coordinated cacophony. Trumpets and shouts joined in, but the bells were the backbone, declaring to every distant neighborhood that power had shifted. Envoys wrote of hearing the entire city answering itself in bronze, as if each district were participating in the ceremony. Whether invited or not, a citizen could be far from the palace, yet still know the empire had a new ruler, simply by listening. The artisans who made these bells occupied a respected, but understated place in Byzantine society. Bell founders worked with bronze in small workshops near the harbours, where both raw materials and skilled labour were available. Casting a large bell required experience, wax models, clay moulds, and carefully balanced alloys to produce the desired tone. Bells could crack during cooling or sound dull if the mixture was wrong, and these failures were expensive. A perfect bell, on the other hand, could ring for centuries. Some were named, almost like people, and their histories recorded in monastery archives. Bells also accumulated layers of meaning over time. A bell that had survived a siege or marked a particularly famous Easter supper might be treated with quiet reverence. Some were believed to carry blessings through their sound, a concept not unique to Byzantium, but deeply felt in a city where sacred and civic life were intertwined. To hear such a bell ring was to be reminded of continuity, survival, and shared memory. Children grew up with these sounds and grew old listening to the same tones, unchanged while generations shifted around them. Inside the Hagia Sophia, the bells blended with a soundscape that was unlike anything else in the medieval world. The acoustics of the Great Dome amplified and prolonged every sound. Chants echoed for seconds after the last voice fell silent. Footsteps dissolved into soft whispers, and bells resonated like distant thunder made domestic. Visitors described the auditory experience as overwhelming, even disorienting, when the bells signaled the beginning of a service. The sound filled not just the building but the emotional space of everyone inside, as if the air itself had thickened with bronze. It's worth remembering that for most Byzantines, life unfolded in proximity to these sounds. Houses were close together, churches were everywhere, and monasteries dotted the landscape like patient sentinels. People didn't need to seek out bells. They lived within their reach. Even those who worked at night or lived on the fringes of the city learned the rhythms. A sailor returning before dawn could tell whether he was late simply by listening for the matins bells. A market woman could tell when to pack up her goods by the evening vespers drifting down from a nearby church. It was a city ruled not only by emperors and patriarchs, but by sound. And in quieter moments, the bells became companions. A lone walker in the pre-dawn streets might hear a single bell striking in a monastery far away, its tones softened by fog and distance. Such moments gave Constantinople a strange intimacy for a city so vast. It was easy to imagine, for an instant, that the sound was meant only for you. It threaded through arches, over walls and across waters, pulling the listener into the city's slow, patient heartbeat. These nocturnal sounds lingered into early morning, when the first light touched domes and rooftops. The bells for prime rung at sunrise were not loud in every district, but their echoes carried like gentle nudges. Fishermen pushed off, shopkeepers opened shutters, monks filed into chapels, and imperial bureaucrats began shuffling into their offices in the great palace. The city awoke not with alarms or shouts, but with overlapping tones, a collective rising shaped by bronze and wood. If you had lived in Byzantium long enough, you would stop hearing the bells as separate events. They became part of the background rhythm of existence, like breathing or the tide. And yet, during festivals, funerals, or emergencies, that rhythm could change suddenly, and everyone would notice. It was a city that could speak to itself at a moment's notice, using nothing more than suspended metal and a practiced hand. As daylight settled fully over Constantinople, the bells stepped into their most structured role. Morning was the city's busiest time, and the sounds layered themselves in a way that mirrored its social hierarchy. The earliest tones belonged to monasteries. Long before markets opened, Monks struck some mantra and small bells to call their communities to prayer. These early sounds were steady, unhurried, almost private, echoing down quiet streets where only a few bakers and fishermen were awake. It was a time when the city felt like a network of individual hearts, each with its own pulse, connected by air rather than sight. Then came the Imperial bells. Within the great palace complex, an elaborate maze of halls, courtyards, and ceremonial spaces, bells were struck to signal the start of administrative routines. Courtiers, officials, and soldiers responded to these tones with practiced familiarity. When the palace bells rang mid-morning, clerks hurried through colonnaded passages, messengers gathered for instructions, and officials assembled in reception halls to begin the day's business. Unlike the devotional bells of monasteries, palace bells were crisp and pragmatic, meant to command rather than inspire. Their tones didn't linger, they cut through the ambient sounds like a polished instrument announcing that performance had begun. Elsewhere in the city, bells guided the daily flow of commerce. The Forum of Constantine, still a major urban hub centuries after its foundation, hummed with traders, scribes, entertainers, and itinerant vendors. Bells from nearby churches signaled not just prayer times but also practical intervals. Mid-morning, when shops were fully open, noon when workers paused for food, afternoon when business began to wind down. These rhythms weren't enforced by law so much as reinforced by habit. Shopkeepers learned that customers drifted in after certain bells, and they adapted. A market stall that opened too early found itself waiting in silence. One that opened too late missed the first wave of buyers. The bells also played a subtle role in organizing transportation. Constantinople's harbors were bustling centers of activity, with ferries crossing the Bosporus and cargo ships docking from across the Mediterranean. Bells from coastal monasteries or harbor towers helped signal tides, departures, and arrivals. Mariners used these sounds like rough clocks. A certain bell at a certain hour meant it was time to cast off, if they wanted to ride favorable currents through the straits. Even the Imperial fleet, anchored near the Bucolian Palace, moved in rhythm with these auditory cues. The city's waterways were busy enough that timing mattered, and bells became as important to navigation as stars. Religious life wove itself through these civic patterns seamlessly. Midday bells, often rung for sext prayers, coincided with pauses in work. Citizens might slip into nearby churches for brief devotions, or simply bow their heads where they stood. In a world without constant background noise, the sudden rise of bells in the air could command attention in a way modern cities rarely experience. Their sound was clear, unfiltered, unchallenged by engines or sirens. When a bell rang, conversations paused. Even a jaded merchant might look up, momentarily aware of the shared moment binding thousands of strangers together. During feast days, this daily rhythm expanded into something more elaborate. Imperial and ecclesiastical bells joined forces to create what can only be described as orchestrated citywide performances. Take the Feast of the Annunciation, for example, a major celebration that combined imperial pomp with religious devotion. At dawn, monastery bells began the sequence. Shortly after, Hagia Sophia's bells joined in, their deeper tones resonating across the hills. Finally, palace bells rang, announcing the emperor's participation. Streets filled with processions, clergy carrying crosses and banners, choirs singing beneath the echoes of bronze. For hours, the city was wrapped in sound, a structured crescendo of faith and power. Some of these festivals included carefully planned sound routes. Bells in one district would begin, followed by another set a short distance away, and so on. so that the sound seemed to travel through the city like a wave. Chronicles describe this technique during major Easter processions, when bells rang in carefully timed succession from one church to the next, leading the faithful toward Hagia Sophia. It was less about volume than about presence. The sound guided crowds through narrow streets and broad forums, like an invisible procession leader. Sound also marked social differences. Wealthy districts tended to have access to larger, better cast bells, their tones clearer and carrying farther. Poorer neighborhoods relied on smaller parish bells or even wooden cimantra. The difference wasn't just auditory, it reflected the uneven distribution of resources. Yet even the faintest bell contributed to the city's shared rhythm. A dockside laborer might hear the grand tones of Hagia Sophia rolling faintly across the water, followed by the sharper peal of a local church bell nearby. In this way, the city spoke in multiple registers at once: imperial, ecclesiastical, communal, without ever needing a single voice to unify them. Foreign visitors often found this layering overwhelming. Arab traders noted that Constantinople seemed to announce itself constantly. Western Europeans commented on the lack of silence, sometimes admiring, sometimes bewildered. In Latin cities, bells were important, but Constantinople's density of churches and monasteries meant that bells were never far away. Even in the middle of the day, one could stand in the open and hear half a dozen different tones overlapping, each from a different institution, each carrying its own message. This density also made the city adaptable. When disasters struck, earthquakes, plagues, sudden fires, the bells were mobilized instantly. In 740, when a massive earthquake shook the city, monasteries rang their bells continuously as processions wound through the streets, carrying icons and relics. The sound was both a spiritual response and a practical tool for gathering people. Later, during outbreaks of plague, bells were used to announce processions of relics meant to ward off disease, or to signal moments of collective prayer. The ringing became part of how the city understood catastrophe, not just as warning but as ritual. For imperial ceremonies, the bells became part of carefully engineered spectacles. When foreign ambassadors approached the city by sea, their first sensory impression was often auditory. Bells from coastal monasteries greeted them as they entered the Bosporus. By the time they reached the harbors, palace bells joined in, along with military trumpets and chanting clerics. The sound announced the city's scale and organization before a single wall or dome came into full view. More than one visitor wrote of feeling overwhelmed, describing the approach as entering a city that spoke before it was seen. Inside the palace, these auditory cues were mirrored by precise movements. When the emperor emerged into ceremonial halls, bells sometimes accompanied his appearance, either from nearby chapels or from hidden spaces where servants struck them at exact moments. These signals were part of a choreography designed to create awe. The emperor did not simply walk into a room. He was announced by sound itself, as if the city's voice rose in acknowledgement. Yet for all their grandeur, bells were fragile. Bronze could crack, ropes wore out, towers needed maintenance. The empire employed teams responsible for inspecting and repairing bell structures, particularly in major churches. A cracked bell was a serious issue, not just acoustically, but symbolically. Its tone changed, becoming dull or unpredictable, and people noticed. In a culture that treated sound as meaning, a damaged bell felt like a bad omen. Repairs were performed with solemnity, sometimes accompanied by blessings to restore not only the instrument but its role in the city's shared identity. As afternoon edged toward evening, the bells shifted again. The tone softened, patterns slowed, and the city began to contract from the expansive bustle of midday. Monasteries prepared for vespers. Market bells signaled closing time. Palace bells called officials to wrap up their work. The overlapping sounds that had once driven the city outward now gathered it inward, folding energy back toward homes, cloisters, and barracks. This daily breathing, expanding with morning bells, contracting with evening, was as predictable as the tides. And when the last light began to slip behind the western hills, the bells took on their most contemplative role. Evening prayers, lit by oil lamps and candlelight, filled the air with tones that were slower, deeper, and more deliberate. They echoed through narrow streets, softened by the stone walls, mingled with the smell of cooking fires and the murmur of families settling in. It was a sound that reminded everyone, from emperor to laborer, that the day was ending and that night, along with its own sounds, was waiting. As the evening deepened, Constantinople shifted into a slower register. The bells that had defined the day's pulse softened, spacing their calls across longer intervals. Vespers were the emotional center of the city's auditory twilight, a time when the communal and the spiritual briefly overlapped before night folded everything into quiet. Monasteries led the way. Their bells began to ring, one after another, some with slow, solemn strokes, others with quicker sequences that marked local traditions. From hill to hill, across the harbors, these layered tones settled over the city like a bronze mist. Inside Hagia Sophia, the evening bells were almost theatrical. As dusk filtered through the high windows, shadows stretched across the marble floors. Clergy and choirs assembled in the echoing nave, their movements accompanied by the deep resonance of bells from the courtyard. The sound bounced off the massive dome, circling the interior like a patient bird before finding its way out through open doors and windows. Outside, people paused in the streets to listen, not because it was required, but because it was impossible to ignore. The bells of the great church carried a kind of gravitational pull, gathering the city's attention as light faded. In smaller churches, the effect was more intimate. Parish bells often hung from simple wooden beams or modest towers, their tones less grand but more personal. Neighbors would recognize their parish bells instantly. Every slight crack or quirk in the bronze became part of the neighborhood's identity. When these bells rang at sunset, families knew it was time to close shop fronts, call children home, and prepare for the quieter hours ahead. Food smells drifted into the streets. Lamps were lit in doorways. Even the stray dogs seemed to adjust their pacing to the bell rhythm. Monasteries extended their sonic presence through the Samentron. In some communities, monks struck wooden planks before and after bell sequences, creating alternating layers of percussive and ringing tones. This practice, originally adopted when bells were scarce or restricted, remained beloved for its distinctive sound. In the evening, a Samentron's deep, deliberate knocks felt almost like a heartbeat, underlying the city's fading chatter. If bells were language, the Samentron was punctuation, firm, grounding, unmistakable. The Imperial Palace also had its own twilight rituals. Bells within the complex were used to signal the end of the administrative day. Courtiers dispersed, guards rotated shifts, and servants began their preparations for nighttime. If a ceremony or reception was scheduled, the palace bells might sound again after sunset, not loudly, but in carefully measured tones meant to draw attention without disrupting religious services elsewhere. This careful coordination reflected Constantinople's peculiar balance between imperial authority and ecclesiastical presence. Bells were not merely tools, they were participants in a delicate choreography. Evening was also the preferred time for processions. Many religious festivals included nighttime rituals, especially during warm months. Lanterns lined streets, icons were carried on wooden platforms, and bells accompanied the movement like steady companions. Monks and lay people walked side by side, their chants blending with the metallic rhythm. These processions moved slowly through neighborhoods, sometimes ending at the city walls or along the harbors, where bells echoed over water. For residents who did not join the march, the sound alone was enough to trace its progress. A family standing on a balcony could hear the approach, the passing, and the fading away of a procession without leaving home. There were quieter evenings, too. On ordinary nights, without festivals, the bells created something subtler, a kind of shared lullaby. After Vespers, most of the city gradually emptied into private spaces. Traders counted coins by lamplight. Scribes rolled up scrolls. Monks began their evening readings. Boats at the harbor creaked against the docks. In these hours, a single distant bell could feel enormous. Its tone drifted through narrow alleys, over tiled roofs, slipping through shuttered windows like a reminder that even in solitude one was still part of a larger rhythm. In some districts, evening bells had secondary functions. Neighborhood watch groups used them to mark curfews or patrol changes. A short, sharp sequence in the late hours might signal that gates were being closed. Constantinople's neighborhoods often maintained their own internal defenses, small gates, walls, or controlled entry points, and bells helped coordinate these closures without written timetables. The same sound that earlier had called people to prayer might now tell them to stay within their quarter for the night. It was a practical use layered onto a spiritual signal. The psychological effect of these bells on the population is difficult to quantify but easy to imagine. In a world without electric light, sound structured perception of time, a child growing up in the city would have learned the day through their ears. Matins meant morning, midday bells meant food and rest, vespers meant lamps and quiet. The bells were the framework around which personal memories hung. A wedding might be remembered not by the exact hour, but by which bell rang during the procession. A death might be marked by the muffled tolling that followed sunset. Time was not numbers, it was sound and light fading in concert. Seasonal variations deepened this experience. In winter, when nights fell early and cold winds swept through the city, bells seemed sharper, their tones cutting through the dense air. People huddled indoors, listening to the distant sounds from monasteries on the hills. In summer, the bells mingled with evening breezes, lantern light, and late-night markets, sounding almost leisurely. During Easter week, the bells of every church rang more frequently and joyfully, filling the night with overlapping peals that lasted long into the hours when the city would normally sleep. During Lent, the tones were subdued, slower, almost ascetic in their rhythm. The bells told the city which season it was as surely as the sun did. Foreigners arriving after sunset often found this atmosphere unforgettable. Arab merchants described the evening bells as threads of metal singing in the dark. Western travelers, used to fewer and simpler bell patterns, sometimes found the complexity disorienting but moving. One chronicler from the 11th century wrote that he could not tell how many churches were ringing because the sound was like a single great bell struck by a giant hand, though I knew it came from many mouths. That was precisely the effect the Byzantines cultivated, a chorus of individual voices forming a single civic sound. The absence of bells could be equally striking. During times of mourning, plague, or imperial edict, Bells might fall silent. The quiet, unsettled people, merchants, moved more cautiously. Monks struck Sumantra more often, and the city seemed to hold its breath. When the silence finally lifted and bells resumed their patterns, citizens often described the sound as a relief, almost like waking from a long, uneasy dream. Bells were not merely heard, they were felt. Over centuries, these evening patterns became as enduring as the city walls. Empires shifted, emperors rose and fell, crusaders came and went, but the bells kept their schedule. Even after the Latin conquest in 1204 disrupted so many of Constantinople's traditions, chroniclers noted that bells continued to mark prayers in surviving monasteries. Though their sounds were fewer, they persisted, clinging to their role as keepers of rhythm when politics could no longer guarantee stability. The bells did not need to be noticed to be effective. Their greatest power lay in their reliability. Each evening, as shadows lengthened, they told the city what time it was, not in numbers, but in tones that stretched across hills, harbors, and courtyards. They stitched together emperors and dock workers, monks and merchants, into a single fabric of shared awareness. They did not ask for attention. They simply rang, and the city responded. And as darkness finally settled, the bells quieted again. The last tones of compline drifted upward into the night, fading into the steady hum of a city that had learned to sleep in rhythm with bronze. By the time night fully claimed Constantinople, the bells had finished most of their daily duties. What remained were the faint, deliberate tones of monastic communities, keeping vigil, midnight prayers. Nocturnes were marked by slow, solemn ringing, often accompanied by the deep thud of Sumantra. In some parts of the city, particularly near large monasteries, these sounds became part of the nocturnal atmosphere. Sailors on night watch heard them drifting down from the hills. Travelers arriving late by sea found their way guided not by torches alone, but by the rhythmic calls echoing from churchyards. The city did not sleep uniformly. Certain districts hummed with low activity even at late hours. Bakeries prepared bread for the next morning. Harbor crews managed late cargo arrivals. Soldiers kept their posts along the Theodosian walls, their ears tuned for the quick clang of alarm bells that could erupt without warning. These night bells were not decorative. They were direct, functional, sometimes harsh. Short bursts struck rapidly to summon help or to signal a change in guard rotations. The same instruments that hours earlier had rung for vespers could now carry messages of danger or urgency. For most citizens, though, night was defined by an absence of bells rather than their presence. After the final complying tones faded, the city settled into its quietest hours. Dogs barked, wind whispered through narrow alleys, water lapped against harbor walls. Against this muted backdrop, a single bell could sound startlingly vivid. Chronicles sometimes mention moments when an unexpected bell rang deep in the night, sending ripples of unease through neighborhoods. Was it a fire, an imperial summons, a call to arms? Bells at the wrong hour meant that something had shifted. Bells also shaped how people experienced extraordinary events. Eclipses, comets, or sudden storms often inspired ad hoc bell ringing. As communities turned to prayer in a society where celestial phenomena were read as omens, bells became the city's collective reflex. Their tones accompanied processions of icons, prayers against disaster, and moments when people crowded into church courtyards at night to watch the sky. The sound and the spectacle intertwined, each amplifying the other. When the bells rang against a backdrop of lightning over the Bosporus, the city must have felt at once fragile and eternal. The great church bells of Hagia Sophia and other major basilicas acquired reputations that transcended their immediate functions. Some were credited with miraculous origins. Stories circulated that angels or saints had guided their casting, or that their tones could calm storms at sea. While such tales were embroidered over time, they reveal the reverence Byzantines held for these instruments. Bells were not just technology, they were repositories of memory, identity, and sometimes superstition. People gave them names, noted their quirks, and spoke of them as if they were citizens in their own right. Imperial politics occasionally turned its ear toward bells as well, because they carried sound far and wide. Bells had a kind of informal broadcasting power. There were moments when rival factions tried to control bell ringing, especially during periods of contested imperial succession. A church loyal to one claimant might ring its bells to rally support, while another fell into suspicious silence. Chroniclers note episodes when groups of citizens rushed toward ringing bells at night, thinking imperial troops had arrived or a usurper had seized the palace. Sound became signal, and signal became action. In quieter years, the bells carried something subtler: continuity. They marked the passing of generations with their regular, unhurried tones. A child born in Constantinople might hear the same bells ring at matins decades later as an adult, their sound unchanged even as emperors and patriarchs came and went. Weddings, funerals, baptisms, victories and disasters all passed through these same bronze throats. When people spoke of the voice of the city, they often meant the bells. Byzantine theology gave this constancy a sacred edge. Bells were believed to sanctify the air through their sound, driving away harmful spirits or purifying the space over which their tones traveled. The idea was not unique to Byzantium, but here it found elaborate expression. Bell ringing accompanied not only services but the blessing of waters, the consecration of new churches, and the annual cycles of holy days that defined Byzantine religious life. Their sound traced invisible boundaries between sacred and profane, reassuring listeners that their city was enveloped in layers of protection. As centuries passed, these sounds became woven into the identity of the capital as deeply as its walls or its domes. Visitors arriving from distant lands were greeted first by bells, often before they saw the city itself. Diplomats wrote of approaching Constantinople at dawn and hearing bells echo across the water, their tones mingling with seagulls and the creak of ships. Merchants described orienting themselves by bell sounds when lost in unfamiliar districts. Pilgrims remembered the bells of Hagia Sophia long after the mosaics had faded from their memory. Even during decline, when the empire weakened and the city shrank, bells retained their role. In the years before the Fourth Crusade's disastrous sack in 1204, chroniclers record bells continuing their routines, as though the city could will itself into stability through sound alone. The Latin conquest temporarily silenced many of these bells. Some melted down, others removed, but the memory of their rhythms lingered. When the Byzantines reclaimed the city in 1261, one of the first acts in certain churches was to ring surviving bells again, a symbolic restoration of the city's voice. Under Ottoman rule after 1453, the soundscape changed dramatically. Islamic calls to prayer replaced the dominant bell tones as the city's primary auditory markers. Many bells were taken down or silenced, yet even then, the memory of Byzantium's bells survived in travelers' accounts and in the traditions of Orthodox communities who continued to ring smaller bells and semantra within permitted spaces. The sound never disappeared entirely. It retreated like an echo moving down a long corridor. Looking back, it's clear that bells did more than tell time or announce events. They shaped how people experienced their environment. They synchronized lives, framed rituals, mediated between power and population, and marked both triumph and catastrophe. Their tones carried across walls, harbors, and hills, stitching together a city that was vast, complex, and often fragile. They were instruments, but also narrators, recounting the empire's daily life in patterns of bronze. To walk through Constantinople 1,000 years ago was to live inside this sonic architecture. You might rise to the matins, bells of a nearby monastery, work by the rhythm of church and market bells, witness imperial processions heralded by orchestrated tones, pause your steps at vespers as Hagia Sophia's bells rolled over the rooftops, and fall asleep beneath the soft, persistent knocks of a distant sementron. Sound was not decoration, it was structure, and if you stood alone at night on the sea walls, listening across the dark waters, you would hear it too, the distant, measured ringing of bells carried by wind, as if the entire city were breathing through bronze. Every chapter leaves a trace, and those traces twist into the next story, sharper, stranger, and pulling us deeper than before. The past doesn't rest, and neither will we. This is the Han Dynasty's Imperial Eunuchs, power behind the throne. The imperial court of the Han Dynasty was never really as serene as the official paintings might suggest. Behind the careful etiquette, the feathered fans, and the poetry about harmonious governance, there was always a quiet scramble for influence. Some of the most unlikely figures in this contest were men who, by definition, were supposed to be politically harmless, eunuchs, surgically altered to serve in close proximity to the emperor without the risk of building their own dynasties. They were meant to be loyal, neutral servants. In practice, they became some of the most powerful political operators in Chinese history. When the Han Dynasty was founded in 2006 BCE by Liu Bang, later Emperor Gaozu, it was still very much a military project. The empire rose out of the rubble left by the collapse of the Qin, and the early rulers were busy putting out fires. Eunuchs existed in the palace from the beginning, but their roles were at first administrative and domestic. They managed the emperor's chambers, kept order in the women's quarters, carried messages, and handled the logistics that no aristocrat wanted to think about. This included things like ensuring the court had enough lamp oil and maintaining the personal wardrobe of the Son of Heaven. Hardly glamorous work. Their proximity, however, was their greatest asset. In a court where even high ministers often had to wait for formal audiences, eunuchs could simply walk into the emperor's private rooms. They saw him when he was tired, when he was sick, when he was irritated with his advisors. They held his seal, managed his letters, and sometimes even slept in the same building. It didn't take long for a few clever eunuchs to realize that controlling access to the emperor meant controlling information, and therefore controlling decisions. In the Western Han period, this influence grew slowly. Most emperors were adults or seasoned rulers, and the bureaucracy was relatively strong. But the imperial family had a habit of producing young heirs. Whenever a boy emperor took the throne, the palace filled with regents, dowager empresses, ambitious relatives, and nervous officials trying to steer the ship. Eunuchs thrived in this environment. They became the indispensable intermediaries between the child emperor and the wider political world. One of the earliest examples of this came during the reign of Emperor Wu, who ruled from 1401 to 87 BCE. His court was famously elaborate and ceremonial, with layers upon layers of ritual and strict hierarchies. Eunuchs handled many of the personal aspects of his daily life. Some acted as gatekeepers, filtering which petitions and visitors reached his eyes and ears. Others managed the movement of documents between the outer court and the emperor's inner apartments. A few became trusted confidants, advising him on personal matters or providing information they gleaned through palace gossip. It wasn't exactly an official advisory position, but it could be far more influential than one. The real turning point came much later, as the Han Dynasty entered its more turbulent middle centuries. The pattern was painfully repetitive. An emperor would die young. A child would ascend. A dowager empress, usually the boy's mother or grandmother, would take power as regent. Her male relatives, often her brothers or nephews, would flood the court, hungry for control, and somewhere in the background, a small group of eunuchs would be quietly holding the keys to the emperor's chambers, controlling who spoke to him and what he heard. These eunuchs did not have sons of their own, of course, but they could adopt nephews or favor protégés. They built networks within the palace staff. They aligned with particular court factions when it suited them, and they switched sides if the political winds changed, because they were technically servants, not officials. They were not always bound by the same bureaucratic rules. Ministers might be censured or impeached for overstepping their bounds. Eunuchs often operated in the shadows beyond the formal gaze of the censorate. As the dynasty aged, emperors became increasingly dependent on their inner circle to manage affairs. This was partly a result of long reigns followed by sudden deaths that left children on the throne. It was also partly because the Han imperial structure itself encouraged the emperor to stay aloof. He was not supposed to be constantly mingling with ministers. He was supposed to issue commands through intermediaries. Eunuchs were perfectly placed to fill that role. One of the more emblematic figures of this period was Zhang Rang, a eunuch who rose to power during the late Eastern Han. He didn't appear out of nowhere. His rise was part of a larger wave of eunuchs who gained immense influence during the reigns of weak emperors in the 2nd century CE. By that time, the Han bureaucracy had become a dense forest of factions, and the eunuchs were skilled at navigating its pathways. But before Zhang Rang, there were others who paved the way. In the reign of Emperor Huan, 1407–1607 CE, the eunuchs made a decisive move. The emperor had grown tired of the domineering influence of his in-laws, particularly the Lang family. The Lang clan had been running the government through their connection to the Empress Dowager, and officials had little choice but to follow their lead. Huan, frustrated with being sidelined in his own court, turned to the eunuchs. They helped him stage a palace coup in 1509 CE, overthrowing the Lang family's grip on power. The emperor rewarded them handsomely, granting them titles and lands, and opening the door for them to play a central role in governance. This event marked a kind of point of no return. Once eunuchs demonstrated that they could help emperors break the power of aristocratic families, they became indispensable political partners. They were not just servants anymore, they were kingmakers. The number of eunuchs in the palace exploded during this time. By some estimates, there were thousands of eunuchs employed in various capacities. By the late Eastern Han, not all were political players. Many were still involved in menial or ceremonial work, but a small inner circle, the so-called 10 attendants, became notorious for their control over the imperial court. The name was a bit misleading since there were actually more than 10 of them, but the group became a symbol of palace manipulation. Their power came not from formal office, but from control over the emperor's person. They decided who could visit him. They read and sometimes altered edicts before they reached the bureaucracy. They whispered rumors in the emperor's ear and carried his responses back to ministers. In a political culture that revered the emperor's word as law, the ability to shape or delay that word was extraordinarily potent. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, scholar officials and Confucian moralists grew increasingly uneasy. They saw eunuchs as dangerous interlopers, men without family lines, education, or legitimate status, who were nonetheless steering the ship of state. Their critiques often used moral language, describing eunuchs as corrupting influences or as signs of dynastic decay. It wasn't that eunuchs were uniquely wicked. Rather, their power represented a fundamental distortion of the ideal Confucian order. In theory, virtuous ministers advised a wise emperor. In practice, exhausted or inexperienced emperors leaned on their closest attendants, who happened to be eunuchs. This tension led to repeated purges. Scholar officials would rally, accuse eunuchs of corruption, and convince an emperor to act. And eunuchs would be executed or demoted. But then another emperor would rise, often young or politically isolated, and the eunuchs would return to favor. Their power was cyclical, tied not to ideology but to the structural realities of palace life. Eunuchs also had one key advantage: they were inescapable. Emperors could not simply remove them all, because someone had to manage the palace. The logistics of the inner court required trusted staff who could not father rival heirs. As long as that requirement existed, eunuchs had a foothold. The real question was how large that foothold became. By the late 2nd century, the balance tipped decisively toward the eunuchs. Zhang Rang and his allies were not content to simply pass messages or filter visitors. They began to install their own clients in key government positions, accept bribes for appointments, and interfere in judicial matters. Ministers complained bitterly, but their access to the emperor was tightly controlled. The more they protested, the more isolated they became. Some officials tried to bypass the eunuchs by appealing directly to the emperor through memorials, but these were often intercepted or delayed. Zhang Rang himself became something of a shadow emperor. He referred to himself with lofty titles, and he and his associates lived in extravagant luxury. Contemporary reports described them building mansions, acquiring immense wealth, and holding private banquets that rivaled the imperial court itself. Their dominance was so complete that many officials began to think of the emperor as a figurehead. This situation set the stage for a series of confrontations that would rock the dynasty to its core. The court split into two broad factions: the eunuchs, who held the emperor and the palace, and the scholar officials, many aligned with Confucian principles, who saw themselves as defenders of proper governance. The struggle between these two groups would eventually help trigger the political breakdown that led to the dynasty's fall. For now, though, the eunuchs enjoyed a kind of quiet supremacy. They had survived purges, navigated coups, and positioned themselves at the heart of imperial decision-making. The empire stretched from Central Asia to the South China Sea, yet at its center the true levers of power were sometimes pulled by men who had started their lives as lowly servants in the palace. As the court drifted toward crisis, these palace operators were about to face their greatest test, one that would involve emperors, empresses, generals, and a storm of resentment that had been building for decades. It was during the late Eastern Han period, particularly under Emperor Ling, that the eunuch's dominance reached its most dramatic peak. Emperor Ling ascended the throne as a child in 1608 CE, and from that moment onward, the palace became a swirling vortex of competing factions. As a boy, he naturally depended on his attendants for daily matters. Unfortunately for the court, those attendants were ambitious men with a growing sense of their own power. The 10 attendants were not literally 10 individuals. but a loosely defined clique of senior eunuchs who controlled access to the emperor and coordinated their political activities. Their names, Shang Rang, Zhao Zhong, Xia Yun, Guo Sheng, Duan Gui, Tao Jie, Wang Fu, Zhang Gong, Han Fang, and Zhu Yuan were well known to contemporaries. Though not everyone agreed exactly who counted as a core member, what mattered was that they functioned as a cohesive political bloc, something relatively new in the palace. They weren't simply individual favorites competing for attention. They acted together to dominate imperial decision-making. Their rise was facilitated by Emperor Ling's temperament. As he matured, he showed more interest in personal pleasures and palace projects than in the grinding work of governance. He built lavish gardens, sponsored costly construction projects, and enjoyed theatrical entertainments. None of these pursuits were unusual for an emperor with absolute power, but they required enormous sums of money to fund his expenses. Emperor Ling began selling government positions to the highest bidder, a practice that was technically illegal but increasingly common. The eunuchs became the brokers of this marketplace. Since they controlled access to the emperor, aspiring officials paid them to secure promotions or appointments. The 10 attendants took their cut and ensured that their allies occupied key posts. The result was a kind of creeping privatization of imperial authority. Official titles and responsibilities were distributed not through examination or seniority, but through personal networks and bribes. Once installed, these purchased officials often recouped their investments by squeezing local populations for extra taxes or skimming from the treasury. Corruption was hardly a new phenomenon in imperial China, but under the eunuch's ascendancy, it became more systematized. It wasn't just tolerated, it was baked into the structure of governance. Meanwhile, outside the palace, scholar officials were not amused. Many of them were steeped in Confucian ideology, which emphasized moral uprightness and proper hierarchies. To them, the eunuchs represented everything that had gone wrong with the dynasty. They were uneducated, unfilial, and in their eyes, morally suspect. Their rise was proof that the emperor had abandoned the path of virtue. This tension crystallized in a movement known as the partisan prohibition. In 1668, a group of officials and scholars petitioned the throne to remove the eunuchs from power and restore proper governance. Their protest was relatively mild, but the eunuchs saw it as a direct threat. They persuaded the emperor to arrest many of the scholars and blacklist them from government service. This was the first of the partisan prohibitions, effectively criminalizing dissent against eunuch authority. It had the unintended consequence of radicalizing a whole generation of educated elites, who now saw themselves as righteous defenders of moral order against a decadent inner court. The eunuchs' response to these movements was both clever and ruthless. They didn't rely on brute force alone. They used their control of information to discredit their enemies, accusing them of forming secret factions or plotting rebellion. Some officials were dismissed, others imprisoned, and a few executed. But the scholar officials did not disappear. They retreated into private life, continuing to circulate critical writings and build networks outside the capital. Over time, their resentment fermented like a sealed jar of wine left in the sun. Within the palace, the 10 attendants began to see themselves as indispensable. Zhang Rang, the most prominent among them, was especially confident. Emperor Ling trusted him deeply and referred to him affectionately as father. It was not a literal familial bond, of course, but it reflected the emperor's reliance on his eunuch confidant. Zhang Rang reciprocated with displays of loyalty and deference, but he also wielded enormous power behind the scenes. His word could make or break careers. The lifestyle of the eunuchs during this time would have shocked earlier generations. They lived in opulent mansions, with gardens and servants. They wore fine silk garments, hosted elaborate banquets, and enjoyed privileges that rivaled or exceeded those of high-ranking nobles. For men who had started as palace servants, it was a remarkable transformation. This sudden rise in wealth and status did not go unnoticed. Outside the palace, officials and commoners alike grumbled that the eunuchs were plundering the empire. Their growing arrogance also led to internal tensions. While the 10 attendants presented a united front, they were still human. They competed for imperial favor, undermined each other's clients, and occasionally sabotaged one another's scheme. It was a delicate dance, cooperation in public, rivalry in private. So long as Emperor Ling supported them, however, they remained secure. The emperor's death in 189 CE changed everything. He left behind 2 sons, Luo Bian, the older but considered weak, and Luo Shui, the younger but more intelligent and favored by some factions. The court immediately fractured. The Empress Dowager, he supported Luo Bian, who became Emperor Shao. Her brother, General-in-Chief, He Jin, became the most powerful military figure in the empire. He Jin hated the eunuchs. Like many military men, he viewed them as parasitic courtiers, undermining the state. He began plotting to remove them from power entirely. Zhang Rang and his allies were well aware of these plans. He Jin had the army, but the eunuchs had the palace. They controlled the young emperor and the dowager empress' daily life. They could intercept orders, delay decrees, and manipulate the imperial seal. A tense standoff developed in the capital, with soldiers gathering outside the palace walls while eunuchs held the gates from within. It was a recipe for disaster. He Jin made a fateful decision. Instead of acting swiftly, he tried to recruit powerful warlords from outside the capital to support his cause. One of them was Dong Zhuo, a frontier general with a reputation for ruthlessness. Summoning him was like inviting a tiger into a house already filled with nervous chickens. The eunuchs, sensing imminent danger, struck first. In a classic palace coup, they lured He Jin into the palace under the pretense of a meeting with the Empress Dowager. Once inside, they ambushed and killed him. It was a decisive but desperate act. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. He Jin's troops stormed the palace in retaliation, slaughtering eunuchs wherever they found them. Blood flowed through the corridors. Many eunuchs tried to escape by disguising themselves or hiding in secret passages. Some fled with the young emperor, attempting to hold him as a kind of living shield. In the chaos, Zhongrang is said to have fled to the Yellow River, where, facing capture, he drowned himself. Whether this was a noble suicide or a panicked accident is unclear. The records differ, but either way his career ended in the water. This massacre marked the end of eunuch supremacy at the Han court, at least in its previous form. The 10 attendants were wiped out, and their network collapsed overnight. But the damage had already been done. The central government was paralyzed. Dong Zhuo arrived with his troops, seized the emperor, and took control of the capital. What followed was a cascade of warlord conflicts, rebellions, and fragmentation that would eventually bring the Han Dynasty to its knees. The eunuchs had not caused all of this on their own. Of course, they were one symptom of deeper structural problems. Weak emperors, factionalism, economic strain, and military disunity. But their rise and fall illustrated how personal access to the throne could reshape an entire empire. For over a century, they had drifted from servants to kingmakers, from intermediaries to power brokers. In the end, their influence collapsed as quickly as it had expanded, leaving a vacuum that ambitious generals were only too happy to fill. As the political center fractured and the dynasty slid toward war, the memory of the eunuchs lingered. Later historians would cast them as villains, the corrupt courtiers who brought down a great empire. The reality was more complicated and far less theatrical. They were products of the palace system, thriving in the shadows where official power faltered. When the spotlight finally turned on them, it was not because they had suddenly become more wicked, but because the entire stage was collapsing. Even after the dramatic massacre of 1809 CE, the story of Han eunuchs doesn't simply end. Like bamboo shoots after a storm, they reappeared in different forms, though never quite with the same sweeping dominance as Zhang Rang's clique. Their persistence reveals something essential about imperial governance. No matter how many times scholar officials or generals tried to sweep them away, the structure of the court itself made their presence almost inevitable. The palace was a self-contained world, physically separated from the outer government. Ministers, generals, and provincial governors lived and worked outside the inner court, bound by layers of ritual and etiquette. To speak with the emperor, one had to pass through a gauntlet of protocols, audiences, memorials, and intermediaries. So eunuchs were the permanent staff of this inner world. They weren't just servants, they were fixtures. They managed the emperor's sleeping quarters, guarded the palace gates, tended the ceremonial halls, and ensured that the rhythms of imperial life continued. If a new emperor was enthroned, a frequent occurrence, given the short and precarious lives of Han rulers, it was eunuchs who taught him how to behave as emperor, how to conduct rituals, and where to stand during ceremonies. They were, in other words, the institutional memory of the palace. This gave them a subtle but undeniable leverage. Scholar officials could write essays on virtue and governance, but many of them had never spent a night inside the palace walls. Eunuchs lived there. They knew which ministers had offended the previous emperor, which concubines were favored, which servants could be trusted, and which doors led where, in a political system where information was as valuable as armies. This inside knowledge was priceless. Their physical closeness to the emperor also mattered deeply. From a young age, imperial princes were surrounded by eunuchs. These attendants dressed them, woke them, prepared their food, and accompanied them in their daily routines. For a child emperor, these men were often the most familiar adults in his life. Ministers appeared occasionally, distant figures with formal petitions. Eunuchs were there at bedtime. It created a bond that, while not necessarily affectionate, was certainly habitual. When that child became emperor, it was natural for him to trust the people he already knew. The Confucian bureaucrats disliked this arrangement, but could not fully dismantle it. They needed the eunuch's logistical labor. Someone had to keep the palace functioning. The bureaucracy could impeach a minister or exile a general, but it couldn't replace thousands of palace attendants overnight. Each new attempt to purge eunuchs created temporary disruption, followed by gradual reinstatement. It was like trying to remove water from a sponge by squeezing it. Worked for a moment, then seeped back. There was also a psychological component. Emperors often found the outer court intimidating. Scholar officials came armed with moral lectures, statistics, and long lists of grievances. They expected the emperor to follow proper Confucian etiquette and rule in accordance with elaborate norms. Eunuchs, by contrast, did not publicly challenge imperial authority. Their power was indirect and personal. For emperors who disliked being corrected, eunuchs were comforting allies. They might whisper advice or shape access, but they rarely stood in open opposition. It was much easier to trust someone who never publicly argued with you. The institutional structure of the Han court effectively created two governments, one outer, staffed by officials and military leaders, and one inner, staffed by eunuchs and palace women. In theory, the emperor sat at the intersection of these two spheres, balancing their input. In practice, the balance shifted depending on the ruler's personality, age, and health. A strong, adult emperor might lean on his ministers and keep eunuchs in the background. A young or disengaged emperor might do the opposite. Over the 2 centuries of Han rule, this oscillation repeated so often it became almost predictable. It wasn't just about personalities, though. It was also about survival strategies. Scholar officials came from families with lineage, wealth, and regional power bases. Their fortunes were tied to their clans and their provinces. Eunuchs, by contrast, had no families of their own, at least not officially. Their survival depended entirely on the emperor's favor. That made them paradoxically safer political allies for insecure emperors. A minister might have his own agenda. A eunuch's entire identity was bound up with serving the throne. Of course, this didn't make them saints. Many eunuchs exploited their positions for personal gain, but their lack of independent power bases made them politically useful. This dynamic can be seen in miniature in the decades after the 10 attendance fall. Various warlords and regents took control of the court, each trying to stabilize or exploit the imperial institution. They all discovered that eunuchs remained useful intermediaries. When Dongzhuo seized the emperor and moved the capital to Chang'an, eunuchs once again served as attendants, messengers, and gatekeepers. They no longer wielded the sweeping factional power of Zhang Rang's clique, but they still played indispensable roles in day-to-day governance. Some warlords even appointed eunuchs as their personal envoys to the emperor, using them to maintain the appearance of legitimate imperial approval. Later, when the capital shifted again, and rival warlords competed for the young emperor's loyalty, eunuchs were still there, maintaining ceremonial continuity. The dynasty was unraveling, but the palace rituals continued like an old clock that refused to stop ticking even as the house burned down around it. This resilience reflected centuries of accumulated habits and structures that no single purge could erase. What made their power both fragile and enduring was its informality. Eunuchs rarely held official posts in the outer bureaucracy. Their titles were often honorary, vague, or purely internal to the palace. That meant they could be removed swiftly, but it also meant they could reappear just as swiftly, because the structure always had roles for them. Ministers could rail against corrupt eunuchs, purge them, and replace them with others who in time learned the same tricks. The individuals changed, but the system remained. Meanwhile, Confucian scholars developed a kind of narrative rhythm about eunuchs. Each time eunuchs rose in influence, critics would declare it a sign of dynastic decline. Each purge was framed as a moral restoration. Each re-emergence was treated as proof of corruption's persistence. This moral language obscured the more mundane reality. Eunuchs were functionaries whose political influence waxed and waned with imperial weakness. They weren't aberrations, they were structural features of the system. It's telling that later dynasties, even after witnessing the spectacular collapse of Han authority, did not abolish the use of eunuchs. The Tengun, Ming, and even Qing courts all employed eunuchs in significant numbers. In each case, the same dynamic emerged. Proximity to the throne gave them informal power, and repeated attempts to eliminate their influence failed to address the underlying reason they existed in the first place. The Han eunuchs were merely the first major example in Chinese imperial history of this recurring pattern. Their presence also reflected the emperor's peculiar position. He was theoretically the apex of all power, but practically isolated, surrounded by ritual, physically enclosed by the palace, shielded from everyday life by layers of etiquette. The emperor often lived in a kind of curated reality. Eunuchs were his constant companions in that world. They controlled his environment, managed his schedule, and mediated his interactions. Ministers could complain about eunuchs, but they couldn't replicate that kind of intimacy. As the Eastern Han staggered toward its end, eunuchs were no longer dominating the political headlines, but they were still quietly present. Even as warlords carved up the empire, the palace routines continued. The emperor's food was still prepared by eunuchs. His chambers were still cleaned by eunuchs. His personal letters still passed through their hands. They had faded from the dramatic stage of factional power, but they had not vanished into thin air. The irony is that many later historians, writing under new regimes, painted the eunuchs of the late Han as uniquely destructive. They portrayed Zhang Rang and his allies as archetypes of treachery and corruption. But the reality was more nuanced. The eunuch's rise was both a symptom and a mechanism of imperial weakness. They filled gaps left by young emperors, divided elites and cumbersome bureaucratic systems. When the dynasty was strong, eunuchs were servants. When it was weak, they became power brokers. Their story is less about individual wickedness than about how power naturally flows to whoever stands closest to the throne when other structures falter. In the fading years of Han control, as competing warlords encircled the shrinking imperial court, the eunuchs became quieter, less flamboyant figures. They no longer dictated imperial policy, but they continued to operate within the palace's routines. Like silent stagehands moving props behind the scenes of a crumbling play, their survival, despite everything, is a testament to how deeply embedded they were in the machinery of empire. To really understand why eunuchs could accumulate such astonishing power, it helps to look more closely at the upbringing of Han emperors. The Han court was a place of rigid ritual and careful segregation. Imperial princes were born into a world where almost every waking moment was managed by adults, whose job was to mold them into proper rulers, or at least into competent figureheads. Many of these adults were eunuchs. They were constant, dependable, and from the child's perspective, familiar in a way ministers and distant relatives were not. When a prince was born, he was usually placed in the care of palace women and eunuchs almost immediately. His biological mother might be a consort, but depending on her rank, she might have limited access to him. High-ranking consorts had more influence, but even empresses sometimes found themselves kept at a ceremonial distance. The palace system treated the heir not as a family member, but as an imperial asset. From the moment he was capable of understanding language, his world was structured through layers of attendants, tutors, and rituals. Eunuchs played the roles of personal guardians, companions, and logistical managers. They dressed the young prince, woke him at the proper hour, and taught him how to move through the palace according to the strict etiquette of the imperial household. They instructed him in the order of bowing during ceremonies, when to speak, and when to remain silent. They controlled the schedule of lessons, managed the delivery of food, and monitored interactions with other palace residents. For a child growing up in this highly curated environment, the eunuchs weren't distant servants. They were the wallpaper of daily life. This upbringing created deep habits. When that child eventually became emperor, his relationship with the eunuchs wasn't something new to be negotiated. It was simply an extension of what he'd always known. Scholar officials, however well educated, were outsiders who appeared at formal occasions with scrolls and moral arguments. Eunuchs were the ones who had told him bedtime stories, ushered him to lessons, and stood silently outside his chambers at night. Familiarity alone did not guarantee loyalty, of course, but it did create a certain psychological default. Eunuchs were part of the emperor's personal sphere, while ministers were part of the public sphere. The early reigns of many Han emperors followed a similar pattern. A child would ascend the throne after his father's early death, often surrounded by regents and relatives vying for influence. In these moments, eunuchs stepped into the role of facilitators. They could relay messages between the child and various factions, help him navigate palace etiquette, and provide a sense of stability amid the chaos. To outside observers, this might look like manipulation, and sometimes it was, but it also reflected their role as the only consistent adults in the emperor's private world. One striking example comes from the reign of Emperor An, who ruled from 1060 to 125 CE. He ascended the throne as a child, and his grandmother, Empress Dowager Deng Sui, acted as regent. The outer court was dominated by her relatives and trusted officials, while the young emperor lived within the palace's protective cocoon. During this period, eunuchs managed nearly every aspect of his personal life. Ministers submitted petitions through formal channels, but the people actually in his presence were palace women and eunuchs. This arrangement worked relatively smoothly, because Empress Dowager Deng was a capable regent, but it set a precedent. Once she died and the boy grew older, he leaned on the eunuchs he knew, not on the officials who had advised her. Another case unfolded during Emperor Huan's childhood. He came to the throne in 1406 CE as a teenager after a palace coup had eliminated the reigning emperor, who was considered unsuitable. Huan owed his position to the machinations of both outer court factions and inner palace attendants, including eunuchs. When he eventually asserted his own authority, he turned to eunuchs to help him curb the power of the Empress Dowager's relatives. This alliance wasn't necessarily born of deep trust. It was a practical decision shaped by familiarity and palace logistics. The eunuchs could access him freely and execute his private instructions without interference from ministers who might question his decisions. Over time, their role shifted from practical facilitators to indispensable political allies. These patterns were reinforced by the architecture of the palace itself. The imperial compound was divided into inner and outer sections, with gates, corridors, and courtyards creating physical barriers. Scholar officials worked in the outer court, a more public and ceremonial space. Eunuchs operated within the inner court, where the emperor lived and spent most of his time. Access required permission, and eunuchs were often the ones who granted or denied it. The physical structure of the palace thus mirrored and reinforced the social structure. Ministers might theoretically advise the emperor, but eunuchs controlled the doors. Because eunuchs were involved in imperial childhoods from the earliest stages, they also shaped the emperor's perception of loyalty and danger. They were the ones who warned him about which palace servants could be trusted. They reminded him of ceremonial pitfalls that might embarrass him. They explained which ministers were safe to approach. Even if these warnings were self-serving, they framed the emperor's understanding of his environment. Ministers often viewed themselves as the guardians of moral governance, but eunuchs were the guardians of personal experience. The Confucian historians, who later wrote about this period, tended to view such relationships with suspicion. They described eunuchs as cunning flatterers who preyed on impressionable emperors. But that framing overlooks how imperial childhoods actually worked. The emperor was not raised by his father in a warm family environment. He was raised by the palace institution, which meant eunuchs Their influence wasn't an anomaly. It was the natural byproduct of a system that separated the ruler from his biological family and immersed him in a world of attendance and ritual. There's also the factor of age. Many emperors in the Han period came to power before adolescence. A boy of 8 or 9 sitting on the throne could hardly grasp the complexities of provincial administration or military logistics. In those formative years, the people he saw daily shaped his worldview. When he grew older, even if he became more assertive, he often retained his reliance on eunuchs as intermediaries. Ministers might view eunuchs as unworthy competitors, but from the emperor's perspective, they were trusted fixtures. This reliance sometimes produced unintended consequences. Eunuchs who rose alongside an emperor could become immensely powerful, not because they schemed from the start, but because they happened to be in the right place when power was up for grabs. A boy emperor leaning on a familiar attendant could unintentionally elevate that attendant's political significance simply by listening to him more than anyone else. Other factions would then court or attack the eunuch, treating him as a political actor whether he wanted to be one or not. By the time everyone realized what had happened, the eunuch in question might control the palace gates and the emperor's ear. Emperors were not passive puppets, but their options were shaped by their environment. A young emperor surrounded by aggressive factions might find that eunuchs were the only people who did not arrive with armies or family clans, for better or worse. That made them useful allies. Over the decades, this pattern repeated so many times that it became almost invisible to contemporaries, part of the rhythm of palace life. This is why eunuchs' political influence wasn't entirely based on cunning plots. Much of it emerged from their institutional role in imperial childhoods. They were the caretakers who became gatekeepers, the background figures who became central simply because the emperor trusted what was familiar. Ministers could lecture, generals could threaten, but eunuchs could whisper. As the Han Dynasty entered its final fractured decades, this quiet shaping of emperors continued in smaller ways. Even as the outer court descended into chaos, war might rage beyond the walls. But inside the palace, eunuchs were still waking young princes at dawn, dressing them for ceremonies, and teaching them how to bow. The empire could crumble, but the routines of imperial childhood carried on, producing emperors who almost by habit turned to their eunuch attendants for guidance. The rivalry between the scholar official class and the eunuchs was not simply a matter of personality clashes. It was a deep structural competition between two different modes of accessing power. On one side stood the Confucian literati, educated men from elite families, trained in moral philosophy, classics, and administrative procedure. On the other stood the eunuchs, palace insiders, often of humble origin, whose power came from proximity rather than pedigree. These groups occupied different spaces, spoke different political languages, and answered to different expectations. Their antagonism was baked into the very design of the imperial state. Scholar officials emerged from the outer court bureaucracy. Their authority was textual, procedural, and moral. They cited precedents, invoked canonical texts, and framed governance as a moral project, led by virtuous officials under a sagely emperor. Their careers were built through recommendation systems, local service, and gradual promotion through the bureaucracy. Their social networks extended through families and regional power bases. Many of them belonged to wealthy landowning clans with influence far beyond the capital. Eunuchs, by contrast, lived inside the palace walls. Their authority was personal and spatial. They didn't issue proclamations about moral order. They opened and closed doors. They controlled who spoke to the emperor, how quickly messages reached him, and which documents were placed on his desk. Their networks were horizontal within the palace and vertical through their ability to influence imperial decisions. While scholar officials claimed the mantle of moral legitimacy, eunuchs often claimed the mantle of imperial intimacy. One group said, "We speak for the proper order." The other implied, "We speak for the emperor himself." These two modes were not naturally harmonious. Scholar officials found eunuchs' informality infuriating. They spent decades mastering rituals and texts, only to watch a palace attendant bypass the entire chain of command with a whispered suggestion. Eunuchs, meanwhile, found scholar officials arrogant and intrusive. They considered them outsiders who visited occasionally to lecture but did not live in the emperor's world. From their perspective, the literati were meddling moralists who didn't understand palace realities. This tension simmered quietly for much of the Western Han, flaring up occasionally but rarely destabilizing the court. It was only in the Eastern Han, when emperors were frequently young and the bureaucracy more factionalized, that it became explosive. The scholar officials of this period were more self-conscious as a class. They saw themselves as guardians of Confucian orthodoxy and increasingly framed their opposition to eunuchs as a moral crusade. This framing gave their resistance a sharper ideological edge. The partisan prohibitions of the late 2nd century CE epitomized this shift. When groups of officials criticized eunuch dominance and called for reforms, they weren't just complaining about administrative inefficiencies, they were making moral arguments that eunuchs represented a corruption of proper governance, that their influence threatened the cosmic order, that they undermined the emperor's virtue by flattering him. In memorials, scholar officials used a language of decay and decline, portraying themselves as loyal ministers trying to save the dynasty from its own inner rot. Eunuchs responded not by producing counter-arguments but by using their control of imperial access. They could discredit critics by intercepting petitions, accusing them of factionalism, or persuading the emperor that these upright officials were plotting rebellion. The emperor, often young or isolated, might find the eunuchs' framing more immediately persuasive. After all, the eunuchs were the ones in his chambers daily. Scholar officials appeared in formal court sessions, but eunuchs shaped his everyday experience. Over time, repeated accusations of factionalism turned partisan into a political slur, a label used to purge officials en masse. The massacre of 1809 CE and the collapse of eunuch power did not resolve this rivalry. It merely shifted its terrain. Once warlords seized the court, scholar officials continued to invoke eunuch corruption as part of their narrative about why the dynasty had fallen. Later historians, many of them scholars themselves, adopted this framing wholeheartedly. In the official histories, eunuchs became stock villains. Zhao Rang and his allies were described with the kind of moralistic flourish usually reserved for cautionary tales. Scholar officials emerged as tragic heroes, silenced by palace intrigue. The irony is that both groups needed each other more than either would admit. Scholar officials needed eunuchs to convey memorials, manage palace rituals, and keep the emperor accessible. Eunuchs needed scholar officials to run the empire outside the palace walls. Without ministers, the empire's bureaucracy would grind to a halt. Without eunuchs, the emperor would be functionally isolated. In moments of stability, the two groups coexisted in a wary but workable balance. In moments of crisis, young emperors, regencies, power vacuums, that balance shattered. Their rivalry also had a social dimension. Scholar officials came from lineages that valued moral education and viewed eunuchs' origins as lowly. Many eunuchs had entered palace service as boys from poor families, some even as captives. The idea that such men could outrank elite scholars in imperial favor was galling to the literati. The Confucian worldview emphasized clear hierarchies based on education and virtue. Eunuchs, who could not sit for examinations and lacked family lineage, didn't fit into that moral universe. Their power was therefore seen as inherently illegitimate, no matter how practically effective they were. Conversely, eunuchs often viewed scholar officials as hypocrites. They watched them maneuver for positions, bribe their way through recommendations, and engage in factional politics while publicly preaching moral righteousness. Eunuchs lived close enough to see the private failings of these supposedly virtuous officials, which made their lectures ring hollow. If a eunuch whispered something cynical in the emperor's ear about a minister's moral posturing, the emperor might listen, not because the eunuch was wiser, but because he saw the minister only in public, while the eunuch saw him sneaking through palace corridors after hours. The rivalry wasn't entirely about corruption versus virtue. It was about two incompatible claims to authority: moral expertise versus personal proximity. Both had strengths and weakness. Scholar officials could govern provinces and draft laws, but they couldn't stop an emperor from ignoring their advice. Eunuchs could shape imperial decisions in subtle ways, but they lacked the formal structures to govern effectively outside the palace. When both sides worked together, the empire functioned. When they turned on each other, the entire system suffered. The late Eastern Han showed what happened when the rivalry hardened into mutual sabotage. Scholar officials launched ideological campaigns against eunuchs. Eunuchs retaliated with purges and accusations. Each side weakened the other without building anything sustainable in its place. Meanwhile, regional elites and military commanders watched from the sidelines, waiting for their chance. When the capital fell into chaos, it was not because eunuchs had outsmarted everyone or because scholar officials had failed morally. It was because their prolonged rivalry hollowed out the center. Later dynasties tried various ways to balance these forces. Some created more formal eunuch bureaucracies to regulate their activities. Others tightened control over palace access or strengthened the civil service. None fully solved the problem. The structural tension between inner palace power and outer bureaucratic power remained a defining feature of imperial politics for centuries. The Han Dynasty simply experienced the first and perhaps most dramatic version of the conflict. The eunuchs of the Han era didn't invent court politics. They simply operated in a space the bureaucratic system couldn't reach. Scholar officials wrote memorials about virtue. Eunuchs decided whether those memorials reached the emperor's hands. Scholar officials tried to manage the empire through rules. Eunuchs managed the emperor through proximity. It was a slow-burning rivalry that once sparked into open conflict, helped set the stage for the dynasty's disintegration. And yet, even as the rivalry raged, eunuchs continued performing the mundane tasks of palace life. They cleaned, carried, instructed, and stood silently beside the throne. Scholar officials might rage in memorials, but the eunuchs still held the keys to the emperor's chambers each night. The conflict was intense, but it unfolded at a strangely measured pace, like two tectonic plates slowly grinding against each other, until the eventual quake. Beyond the political drama and factional rivalries, much of eunuch power in the Han court came from something far less glamorous: routine. Day after day, the palace was sustained by an elaborate set of rituals, schedules, and invisible labor. It was in these quiet rhythms that eunuchs embedded themselves most deeply. Their authority was often less about making grand political moves, and more about knowing exactly how things worked and ensuring they continued to work. If the scholar officials were the architects of state ideology, The eunuchs were the custodians of imperial daily life. The palace complex of the Han emperors was not just a single building. It was a sprawling network of halls, courtyards, gardens, sleeping chambers, and ceremonial spaces. Moving from one section to another could involve passing through multiple gates, each guarded and monitored. These spaces had their own hierarchies. The outer halls for formal audiences, the middle spaces for semi-official business, and the innermost quarters where the emperor lived. Eunuchs were stationed throughout this maze, performing roles that ranged from guard duty to message carrying, from cleaning ceremonial vessels to coordinating palace rituals. One of the most important responsibilities of palace eunuchs was controlling access. The emperor's time was a precious and tightly scheduled commodity. Ministers could not simply walk in and talk to him. They had to submit requests for audiences, which would be reviewed and scheduled through palace channels. Eunuchs were the ones who physically opened the doors, announced visitors, and decided how quickly messages moved. A memorial that lingered in a eunuch's hands for a day or two could drastically change political outcomes. A minister who waited too long for an audience might lose his opportunity entirely. This gatekeeping function extended to written documents. In an age before telephones, information flowed through physical scrolls. Eunuchs carried these memorials to and from the emperor's private chambers. They decided whether something was delivered immediately there or quietly ignored, because most ministers had no direct access to the emperor's sleeping quarters. They relied on eunuchs to transmit their words. This created countless opportunities for subtle influence. A eunuch could summarize a document to the emperor in a certain tone, emphasize one point while downplaying another, or delay delivery until after a crucial decision had been made elsewhere. Eunuchs also managed ceremonial timing. The emperor's daily schedule was filled with rituals rising at dawn, attending audiences, performing sacrifices, reviewing documents, receiving envoys, and participating in family rites. Someone had to coordinate all of this. Eunuchs served as the human clocks and calendars of the palace. They ensured that ceremonies began on time, that the proper robes were laid out, and that the required participants were present. If a minister arrived too late for an audience, the eunuchs could close the doors, and that was that. There was no arguing with the schedule once it had been set inside. Food preparation and security were another crucial area. Imperial meals were handled with extreme caution to prevent poisoning. Eunuchs supervised kitchen staff, tasted food, and managed the delivery of meals to the emperor. Because the emperor's diet was both a matter of personal health and ritual significance, eunuchs had to follow precise protocols. A trusted eunuch in charge of the imperial kitchen wielded a quiet but real power. Whoever controls the emperor's food controls his comfort and safety. Many eunuchs built their positions on such practical responsibilities before rising to greater influence. Then there were the archives. The palace maintained records of edicts, petitions, and ceremonial events. The eunuchs often served as record keepers, archivists, and scribes. Some were literate and handled the physical preservation of imperial documents. Though they did not usually write policy, their role in preserving and retrieving information gave them a kind of bureaucratic memory that even high officials sometimes lacked. When a minister needed to reference an old edict, it might be a eunuch who produced it or didn't. This embeddedness in the palace machinery meant that eunuchs could exert influence without issuing a single overt command. By controlling when doors opened, when documents were delivered, and when rituals occurred, they could shape the flow of power. A minister who ignored eunuchs or treated them rudely might find his petitions mysteriously delayed. Another, who cultivated relationships with key eunuchs, might find his requests moving more swiftly. Political factions in the outer court understood this and often tried to cultivate eunuch allies, offering gifts, flattery, or promises in exchange for smoother access. Eunuchs themselves operated within their own hierarchies. Not every eunuch had influence. Most performed humble tasks and never rose beyond minor palace service. The handful who did ascend typically began by demonstrating reliability in these routine functions. A eunuch who managed imperial robes flawlessly for years might be entrusted with more sensitive tasks. One who handled documents without error might become a trusted courier. Over time, the most dependable or politically astute among them formed the inner circles around the emperor. These circles were fluid. Emperors could elevate or demote eunuchs at will. A eunuch who fell from favor might be reassigned to a distant part of the palace or dismissed entirely. But because emperors changed frequently, eunuchs with long service could outlast multiple rulers, accumulating knowledge and connections that few ministers could match. A scholar official might serve one emperor before retiring to his home province. A senior eunuch could remain in the palace for decades, observing the rise and fall of factions and learning how to navigate them. It's also important to understand the emotional landscape of the palace. Life inside those walls could be both highly structured and strangely isolating. Emperors, despite their theoretical power, lived in a kind of curated confinement. Eunuchs were among the few people who interacted with them informally, outside the rigid structure of court sessions. They might be present when the emperor was sick, when he was frustrated with ministers, or when he simply wanted to talk. These informal moments were not recorded in official documents, but they were often where real influence was exercised. A casual remark by a eunuch at the right time could shape imperial moods or decisions for the eunuchs themselves. This environment was both opportunity and trap. They lived their entire lives within the palace, cut off from the outside world. They could accumulate wealth and power, but they could never leave to establish families or build independent bases. Their fortunes were tied entirely to the emperor's favor and the delicate networks of palace service. Some became cynical operators, others cautious survivors. A few, remarkably, seem to have remained loyal servants without seeking political power at all, remembered mostly in passing by historians who were more interested in scandals than steady hands. In this sense, eunuch power was less about conspiracy than about infrastructure. They were the palace infrastructure in human form. Remove them entirely, and the palace would stop functioning. Keep them, and their proximity to the emperor gave them inevitable influence. That influence might be subtle or overt, depending on the emperor's personality and the political climate, but it was always there, humming quietly behind the imperial facade. The scholar officials could rail against eunuch corruption all they wanted, but they could not replicate this machinery. They worked in offices outside the palace walls. They relied on formal procedures. Eunuchs were the ones inside, moving through corridors and standing at doors. Even when eunuchs did not actively scheme, their control of palace logistics gave them a kind of passive power that no bureaucratic reform could fully eliminate. As the Han court aged and grew more tangled in factionalism, this quiet authority became the foundation upon which some eunuchs built their political empires. It started with keys, schedules, and food trays, and ended with control of the emperor's voice. It was not inevitable that a eunuch would become a political titan, but the structure of palace life made it possible in a way that was difficult to prevent. As the Eastern Han Dynasty wore on, Eunuchs were no longer content merely to control palace logistics. Many began to participate actively in the distribution of wealth and appointments, transforming their informal access into tangible political capital. This wasn't done through formal edicts or public proclamations. Instead, it unfolded through a web of patronage, private transactions, and what might generously be called informal markets. The palace became not just a place of ritual and governance, but a thriving hub of shadow economics. Selling offices was not a Heian invention, but under Emperor Ling in particular, it reached unprecedented levels. The emperor's own appetite for funds, fueled by expensive building projects, lavish entertainments, and personal luxuries, created a demand for revenue beyond the normal taxation system. Eunuchs, who controlled access to the emperor, became natural brokers. They could whisper in the emperor's ear about a potential appointee, or they could ensure that a memorial recommending someone moved quickly to his desk. For those willing to pay, opportunities abounded. Bribes weren't always crude sacks of coin handed over in dark corridors. Often they took the form of gifts, land grants, or promises of future favors. Provincial officials hoping for promotion might send fine textiles, horses, or artworks to influential eunuchs. Wealthy families might offer eunuchs shares in business ventures or access to estates. Because eunuchs technically had no legitimate heirs, they often used their wealth to support nephews or adoptive sons, creating surrogate family lines that could inherit their fortunes. These adopted heirs sometimes entered officialdom themselves, forming hybrid networks that blended palace insiders with outer court elites. This blending was politically potent. A well-placed eunuch could act as a bridge between the palace and regional power blocks. Scholar officials who publicly decried eunuch corruption might privately court eunuch support, sending gifts through intermediaries, or cultivating friendships to smooth their career paths. In this way, eunuchs became part of the broader fabric of patron-client relations that defined Han politics. Their influence was not limited to whispered words near the throne. It extended out into the provinces through networks of indebted officials. Some eunuchs amassed staggering personal fortunes. Zhang Rang, the most notorious of the 10 attendants, reportedly accumulated wealth rivaling that of entire noble families. Contemporary accounts, admittedly written by hostile Confucian historians, describe his mansions, his banquets, and his entourages of servants. Whether every detail is accurate or not, it's clear that his financial resources were immense. He and his allies used that wealth to reward loyal clients, bribe officials, and reinforced their political dominance. When scholar officials complained of corruption, they weren't entirely wrong. There was a thriving system of transactions beneath the surface. But corruption alone doesn't explain why this system endured for so long. The imperial bureaucracy was vast and often underfunded. Governors and administrators across the empire struggled to pay their staff and maintain infrastructure. Promotions and assignments could take months, even years to process through normal bureaucratic channels. Eunuch intermediaries offered something that bureaucratic procedure often couldn't: speed and certainty. For ambitious officials, paying a eunuch for a quicker path to office might have seemed less like bribery and more like a practical necessity in a sclerotic system. The emperor himself often benefited from this arrangement. Funds from office sales flowed back into palace coffers, financing imperial projects without raising taxes directly. Eunuchs were, in effect, unofficial revenue agents. Of course, they took their share, but as long as the emperor's needs were met, he rarely intervened. In some ways, this arrangement suited the imperial court perfectly. It allowed for flexibility and personal discretion in appointments. bypassing layers of bureaucratic oversight that might slow things down. There was also a cultural element at play. Gift-giving and personal patronage were deeply embedded in Han political culture. Scholar officials might frame eunuch dealings as corrupt, but they themselves participated in similar networks among their own class. What made eunuchs' involvement controversial was not the act of exchanging favors, but their social position as men without formal bureaucratic status. Their role in the patronage system blurred lines that Confucian ideology preferred to keep neat. Their wealth and influence were reminders that the idealized bureaucratic hierarchy did not fully map onto reality. Eunuchs invested their wealth strategically. Many sponsored the careers of young men from modest backgrounds, helping them secure minor posts in exchange for future loyalty. Others funded construction projects in their home regions, quietly building local bases of support through charitable works. Some even patronized religious institutions, endowing temples or sponsoring rituals to enhance their moral reputations. These acts were not purely altruistic. In a society where moral legitimacy mattered, supporting temples or Confucian academies could soften the image of a powerful eunuch and win allies among local elites. Their adoption of heirs was another key mechanism. Though they could not father children, eunuchs often adopted nephews or promising young men. These adopted sons managed their estates, acted as intermediaries with the outside world, and ensured their patrons' legacies continued after their deaths. In some cases, these adopted heirs married into elite families, weaving eunuch wealth into broader aristocratic networks. A eunuch might not have an official lineage, but through adoption, he could create one. Not all eunuchs pursued wealth with such ambition. Many remained focused on palace service, accumulating modest savings, but not seeking grand influence. However, the examples of the 10 attendants, and others like them, demonstrated how far a eunuch could climb if he combined proximity, cunning, and financial acumen. For ambitious eunuchs, politics was not merely about controlling doors and schedules. It was about investing, trading favors, and building alliances that reached far beyond the palace walls. The rise of this shadow economy contributed significantly to the growing resentment among scholar officials. They saw themselves as moral guardians of the state, yet they often found their own careers blocked or shaped by eunuchs who could be paid to open doors. Their memorials denouncing corruption were as much expressions of frustration at lost influence as they were genuine moral objections. The more the eunuchs prospered, the more the scholar officials doubled down on moral rhetoric, portraying eunuch power as a sign of cosmic disorder. This rhetoric gained traction among the educated elite, who circulated critical writings and gathered in private salons to lament the decline of proper governance. They depicted eunuchs as greedy parasites draining the lifeblood of the state. It was a powerful narrative, but it conveniently ignored the ways in which elite families themselves participated in similar practices. In the end, eunuch wealth was both a practical reality of palace politics and a potent symbol of everything their critics claimed was wrong with the dynasty. The eunuchs' economic activities also made them targets. During purges, accusations of hoarding wealth, accepting bribes, or selling offices were standard charges, even if a eunuch's activities had been no worse than those of ministers. The moral outrage attached to eunuch wealth made these accusations stick. When Zhang Rang and his allies fell, their properties were confiscated and redistributed, providing convenient rewards for their political enemies. But their accumulation of wealth had another, subtler effect. It created a kind of parallel power structure inside the empire. Provincial officials who owed their positions to eunuch patrons might prioritize those patrons' interests over imperial or bureaucratic directives. Money flowed through informal channels alongside official revenue streams. Influence traveled not just through edicts but through gifts and debts. By the late 2nd century CE, this shadow economy was so embedded that removing the eunuchs from power didn't eliminate it. The networks simply reconfigured themselves under new patrons. In this way, eunuchs were not merely palace figures. They were actors in the broader economic and political landscape of the empire. Their proximity to the emperor gave them unique leverage, but their wealth and patronage extended their reach far beyond the palace walls. When the dynasty finally crumbled, these networks didn't disappear overnight. Many persisted, absorbed into the patronage systems of warlords and regional elites who took power after the fall. The story of eunuch wealth is often told as a tale of greed. In truth, it is also a story about how imperial institutions created opportunities for alternative channels of power. Eunuchs denied family lines and formal bureaucratic paths, carved out influence where they could, through money, access, and personal networks. Their critics saw corruption. The eunuchs saw survival. As the Han Dynasty slid into fragmentation, the story of the eunuchs did not simply dissolve into the chaos. Their fall from overt political dominance in 1809 CE had been violent and theatrical, but their legacy persisted in more subtle ways, shaping how future dynasties thought about palace power. The eunuchs of the Han became archetypes in the historical imagination, figures to be invoked as cautionary examples, vilified in moral narratives, or quietly imitated by later rulers who recognized their unique utility. In the immediate aftermath of their downfall, the imperial court was seized by warlords, notably Dongzhou. He used the young emperor as a pawn to legitimize his own power, moving the court west to Chang'an and plunging the empire into a protracted era of civil war. In this environment, eunuchs no longer held the central, cohesive influence they once did, but they didn't vanish from palace life. The physical and ceremonial structures of the palace remained intact, and eunuchs continued to staff them. Even as armies clashed across provinces, someone still had to open the palace gates, manage ceremonies, and tend to the emperor's immediate needs. Their role was diminished politically, but institutionally, it was still essential. Later historians, particularly those writing under the Eastern Jin and Tang, looked back at the late Han eunuchs with a mixture of moral indignation and political fascination. Official histories like the Book of the Later Han depicted Zhang Rang and the 10 attendants as symbols of decadence and corruption. There were the villains who whispered poison into imperial ears, sold offices, and accelerated the dynasty's decline. This moral framing fit neatly into Confucian historiography, which liked clear lines between virtuous officials and corrupt courtiers. In reality, as we've drifted through their world, the picture was more ambiguous. Eunuchs were neither uniformly virtuous nor uniquely corrupt. They operated in the spaces the system allowed, sometimes exploiting them ruthlessly, sometimes merely maintaining palace functions. This narrative framing, however, was powerful. For centuries afterward, references to Han eunuchs in political writings became shorthand for warning against inner court corruption. Scholar officials of later dynasties cited them as cautionary tales whenever palace attendants gained too much influence. It was a kind of historical scarecrow, point to Zhang Rang, and everyone nodded solemnly about the dangers of letting eunuchs near the levers of power. Yet emperors themselves often drew a different lesson. The eunuchs' proximity to the throne made them indispensable allies, especially for rulers wary of overmighty ministers or regional clans. Later dynasties like the Tang and Ming reintroduced eunuchs into significant administrative and even military roles. They did so with varying degrees of caution, sometimes establishing separate supervisory offices to monitor eunuch activities. The Ming emperors in particular relied on eunuchs as personal agents, sending them on inspection tours, granting them command over secret services, and using them to bypass the civil bureaucracy. In some ways, this echoed Emperor Horn's reliance on eunuchs to curb his in-laws. Though on a more institutionalized scale, the paradox was enduring. Scholar officials saw eunuchs as signs of dynastic decay, while emperors often saw them as tools of central control. Each side drew different conclusions from the same historical episodes. The eunuchs of the Han became historical ink blots, interpreted according to the anxieties of later generations. Their legacy also lingered in the structure of palace life itself. The basic spatial division between inner and outer courts, emperor and eunuchs inside, officials outside, remained standard in Chinese imperial architecture for nearly 2 millennia. The gatekeeping functions that gave eunuchs their leverage during Han times continued in every subsequent dynasty. So long as emperors lived inside walled compounds and officials stood outside petitioning for access, the potential for eunuch influence remained baked into the system. In literature and folklore, the Han eunuchs were remembered in ways that were both moralizing and dramatic. Plays and popular stories cast them as scheming villains or tragic figures who rose too high and fell too hard. Zheng Rang's death by drowning became a kind of moral punctuation mark, the classic villain meets watery end motif that storytellers found irresistible. Over time, these portrayals blurred historical nuances, cementing eunuchs in the cultural imagination as the sly manipulators behind silk screens, rather than as the complex political actors they actually were. But the echoes weren't just cultural, they were administrative. Later courts experimented with ways to regulate eunuch power without abolishing it. Some imposed strict hierarchies and rotation systems to prevent long-serving eunuchs from building personal networks. Others limited their involvement in outer court affairs. Occasionally, these measures worked for a time. Eventually, though, the same dynamics reappeared. Emperors relied on eunuchs when they distrusted ministers, and eunuchs exploited that trust to gain influence. The Han had merely been the first to experience the cycle in full. It's also worth noting that not all eunuchs were remembered as villains. A few, mostly those who remained focused on ceremonial and domestic duties, were praised in scattered records for their loyalty and steadiness. These quieter figures rarely feature in the grand narratives of rise and fall, but their existence reminds us that the majority of eunuchs were not schemers like Zheng Rang. They were functionaries, sometimes for decades, who kept the palace running while the empire outside convulsed. The legacy of Han eunuchs thus has two intertwined threads. One is moral and rhetorical. They became enduring symbols of corruption in Chinese political discourse. The other is structural and practical. Their roles were necessary features of imperial governance that no dynasty could entirely dispense with. Future regimes might change the rules, but they never fundamentally changed the palace's need for trusted attendants who could not father rival heirs. As long as that need existed, eunuchs remained part of the story. Their individual fates, of course, were often precarious. Eunuch power could rise suddenly with a young emperor's trust and collapse just as suddenly with a military coup or purge. Their lives were lived within walls, tied to the shifting moods of a single household that happened to rule a continent-sized empire. Some navigated this environment brilliantly, others were crushed by it. Few left behind descendants to tell their side of the story. And perhaps that is why the historical narrative became so one-sided. Scholar officials wrote the histories. Emperors occasionally commissioned them. Eunuchs, by contrast, rarely left their own accounts. Their voices are faint echoes in palace records and accusations in officials' memorials. What survives is a story told mostly by their adversaries. Even so, reading between the lines, it's possible to glimpse their world, the quiet corridors, the daily routines, the whispered messages, the subtle manipulations, and the occasional breathtaking grab for power. The fall of the Han Dynasty is usually attributed to broad forces, economic strain, factionalism, military fragmentation, peasant uprisings. The eunuchs were part of that story, not as prime movers of destiny, but as one set of actors who rose in the vacuum created by weak emperors and divided elites. Their story is less about villains toppling a dynasty than about how proximity to power, in a rigidly hierarchical system, can give unexpected groups the ability to shape history. As the empire fractured into the warlord era, the palace and its eunuchs became minor players in a much larger drama. Regional commanders raised armies, provinces broke away, and new regimes emerged. The eunuchs continued to serve the court that remained. Diminished but not extinct, they drifted into history like figures receding down a long, echoing corridor, still there, still necessary, but no longer center stage. Centuries later, when later dynasties looked back on the Han, they saw in its eunuchs both a warning and a model. The warning was simple. Unchecked palace attendance can destabilize the court. The model was equally simple. Trusted palace attendants can keep the emperor's will insulated from meddlesome officials. That tension would play out again and again, like an old melody with new lyrics, across the long sweep of Chinese imperial history. May this story settle in your heart like a whisper, and may your dreams be calm and kind. Good night.